Hey everyone, you know that guy Anthony Fauci? Man, he's the worst, right? He was the COVID guy who did bad stuff with the vaccines or the lockdowns or something or other. I don't remember exactly what he did, but he did many bad things with the virus and he's evil and he should be in jail. Everybody knows that. Or do they? What you just saw was my impression of so many brainwashed people who simply know deep down in their marrow that Fauci is a fraud. But if you ask them why, they turn into a hot mess of conspiracy stew. I had already been planning to do a piece debunking all the Fauci hate, and with him in the news recently for all this crap with Rand Paul, it's a better time than ever to set the record straight. This video will build off of previous content I've made, certainly debunking anti-vaccine propaganda, but also lab leak propaganda, in particular this video. If you were not aware, all the scientific evidence points to SARS coronavirus 2 being of natural origin, emanating originally from illegally stored live animals at the Huanan food market. This video painstakingly goes through the multiple incarnations of lab leak propaganda that has infected public discourse and systematically debunks all of it. So if you are someone who fell for this propaganda, please watch this video first. In this video, I will briefly reiterate a few details from that video, but the case was made immaculately clear over there, and I won't summarize much of it here because there's nothing new to say. Frauds just continue to make baseless claims about lab leak that have already been thoroughly debunked. The conflict which then arises is that the Trump administration is all in on lab leak propaganda. It was started by Steve Bannon to help Trump's 2020 election bid, and he's carrying the torch to this day. This page on whitehouse.gov says, "Lab leak, the true origins of COVID-19. Pretty flashy shit, huh? I especially love this pop-up that says, "Welcome to the golden age." Get all your propaganda straight from the White House, everyone. From the assholes bringing you other greatest hits like, "Climate change isn't real, so let's dismantle the EPA. PFAS are totally fine and don't cause cancer, so let's dismantle the FDA. Genocide isn't real, so dismantle the ICC," and more. We have reached a point in the rise of fascism in America where the state narrative is essentially never aligned with reality, and those who stubbornly cling to reality must be silenced and punished, be they activists or scientists. Now, in that lab leak video, I covered Trump administration staff harassing experts. Martin Kulldorff, for example, is a vaccine advisor at CDC. He and Jeffrey Tucker, president of the right-wing think tank the Brownstone Institute, used an image of a guillotine to claim that experts should be held accountable on COVID-19 vaccine mandates. Pretty subtle, huh? Yes, let's murder scientists who actually know things and defend reality from anti-science propaganda. They changed that image after backlash from experts, but the sentiment remains. This type of violent rhetoric had deadly consequences when an anti-vaxxer murdered police officer David Rose at the CDC. Experts got the message from the Trump administration. Criticize us and we'll provoke violence against you. Once again, whether you're an activist or a scientist. Anyway, getting down to business, possibly the main target of this assault on facts is the immunologist and infectious disease researcher Anthony Fauci. Fauci was head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases within the NIH. He provided important policy guidance and science communication from the AIDS pandemic in the 1980s through the COVID-19 pandemic in the 2020s. Fauci's devotion to facts frustrated Paul Alexander, a science advisor at Trump's HHS in 2020. Paul thus said Fauci should be hanged, along with Dashik and other figures we've discussed before. Trump's NIH head and walking shit-stained Jay Bhattacharya also endorsed a cartoon of Fauci being impaled. Pretty professional, no? What was the basis for all this hatred? Infectious disease experts doing what they can to predict the risk from SARS coronavirus 2. Nothing more. Fauci noted a famous projection from epidemiologist Neil Ferguson's team at Imperial College London. It projected 2.2 million deaths and 270 million infections in the USA for a 2-year period, if everyone took no extra precautions with no policy interventions nor vaccines. And here is Jay talking about that projection over a Zoom presentation.
That IFR 0.9, in other words, even though it looks smaller than the case number, is actually an enormously high number. It says that 1% of the people, roughly 1% of the people that get infected are going to die from this, from the virus. 1 in 100. Again, a number that sent shockwaves around the world and justified this 2.2 million total deaths prediction for the United States.
This, of course, was unacceptable to Jay, who would go on to co-author the pseudoscientific Great Barrington Declaration, which would downplay the risk of the pandemic that would kill over 1 million Americans in order to suck up to corporate interests that felt the economy was more important than human lives. Fauci and Ferguson's science stood in opposition to that. So Fauci issued warnings to the best of his ability given the data available early in the pandemic and endorsed policies to mitigate risk. Ideologues and oligarchs rejected those policies and underestimated risk for obvious reasons, just like they do with regards to pollutants, global warming, and so forth. This is part of the rich history of right-wing science denialists in the US baselessly attacking experts since at least the 1980s on topics such as smoking, vaccines, you name it. The goal of these campaigns is always to reduce public trust in expertise and sensible government action. What's good for the people is bad, and what's good for business is good. So COVID-19 contrarians skewered Fauci by constructing conspiracy theories, lying about evidence, misrepresenting his claims, and ignoring all the instances when he was right and his critics were wrong. To this day, long after the pandemic and all the lives it claimed, they continue to try and distort the history of what happened and who was right about it, because they have to continue to be right even after they were proven wrong. That is why Fauci has been turned into a sacrificial lamb. The Trump administration is sending a message. If you stand up for science in opposition towards the state narrative, this is what happens to you. In this video, we will discuss all the topics that these propaganda peddlers claim Fauci was wrong about. That includes viral origin, viral transmission, mask efficacy, infection risk factors, immunity, policy, vaccines, and pandemic projections. So let's go through that list one at a time. First up, pandemic origins. In 2017, Fauci said that Trump would deal with an outbreak.
And if there's one message that I want to leave with you today, based on my experience, and you'll see that in a moment, is that there is no question that there will be a challenge to the coming administration in the arena of infectious diseases, both chronic infectious diseases in the sense of already ongoing disease, and we have certainly a large burden of that, but also there will be a surprise outbreak. And I hope by the end of my relatively short presentation, you will understand why history, the history of the last 32 years that I've been the director of NIAID, will tell the next administration that there's no doubt in anyone's mind that they will be faced with the challenges that their predecessors were faced with.
Pretty clear, no? Outbreaks happen. All other presidents have had to deal with them. Trump will definitely have to deal with them too. Crackpots take this sensible statement out of context to mean the pandemic was planned. This is insane on many levels, but mainly because it makes no fucking sense for Fauci to publicly admit to such a crime before it even happened, nor would the scientific community fail to react if he did. Instead, his words demonstrated knowledge of timelines like this. This little icon here represents new or ongoing outbreaks and pathogen eradication efforts. Each year had at least one, with most years having more than one. SARS coronavirus 1 in 2003, which was caused by horseshoe bats spread to humans through masked palm civets, monkeypox, mad cow, avian flu, West Nile, Marburg, H1N1, MERS coronavirus, which was spread to humans by camels, Ebola, Zika. This shit never ends. Pathogens are a never-ending problem, and several coronavirus outbreaks had already happened in this century, always of zoonotic origin. Not so scandalous, right? At any rate, it is trivial to predict that an outbreak would happen during Trump's first term because they happen every fucking year. It's like predicting that there will be a mass shooting in America in any given year. Why wouldn't there be? But frauds still wanted to claim Fauci caused the pandemic so they could undercut trust in experts and government funding of virology research. Remember, that's the common through line here. Anyone who hasn't seen my content on other members of Trump's cabinet, like Russ Vought, Lee Zeldin, and Bobby Kennedy, it's all about defunding science to the maximum degree possible, as well as regulatory bodies that can police the private sector. Inconvenient science must be squashed, and inconvenient bureaucracy must be dismantled, all in service of the oligarchy that runs the government. In this spirit, Republican Senator and poodle mop model Rand Paul made a big stink about Fauci funding work at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. Rand claimed this was gain-of-function research that made viruses more dangerous. According to him, this resulted in the manufacturing of SARS coronavirus 2, which supposedly infected lab staff to start the pandemic. But this WIV research was on viruses that couldn't become SARS coronavirus 2. They are simply too genetically dissimilar. They are unrelated. Here is Fauci saying as much himself.
And it certainly didn't come from anything that you've done or did not do.
I mean, that's for sure, because the viruses that were funded by the NIH were so distant from an origin standpoint, or we call it phylogeny, or evolutionarily.
We don't know what that means.
That's right. It's so different
yes.
from SARS that it couldn't possibly have turned into SARS.
We won't go into any detail here since this is all covered in my lab leak video. Nothing at WIV was gain of function, and nothing was related to SARS coronavirus 2. But this was the story that the Republicans decided to run with, so this is what got disseminated to the public. Evil Fauci is a liar, and they were doing nasty Frankenstein science to build the evil virus. Contrary to Rand's lies, Fauci told the truth when he said this was not prohibited gain-of-function research, as noted by virologist Stuart Neal. Rand's claim is deliberate disinformation. The NIH explained how this wasn't prohibited gain-of-function research since it didn't increase risk to humans. Virologist Angela Rasmussen and microbiologist Stanley Perlman agreed. If a virus is not becoming more virulent or transmissible in humans, it is not gain-of-function research. Beyond this, Rand blaming Fauci for funding research of any kind doesn't make sense since funding decisions weren't centralized under Fauci. They were instead decentralized with inputs from many experts. Jay knew this too. He knows exactly how research gets funded, as he admits here. But he pretended otherwise to help his fellow lab leak proponents like Rand target Fauci. Here he is making explicit accusations about controversial research and calling Fauci a liar. If you've watched my other content on this topic, you've seen this paper before, about the proximal origins of SARS coronavirus 2. Rand claimed that Fauci colluded with scientists to unfairly undermine lab leak claims by writing this paper, which argued against specific lab leak scenarios. This is ridiculous. Fauci colluding with a small group of scientists wouldn't control expert assessment across the world in government, academia, industry, and nonprofit groups, along with retired experts. You can't buy off the entire global scientific community to push a sinister agenda. This is a blatant exaggeration of Fauci's power to pretend that he specifically is why the vast majority of experts across the globe have determined that lab leak is far less likely. Rather, experts examined the evidence and concluded that zoonosis is more likely, which once again we explained in great detail in the lab leak video. Part of this assessment includes experts familiar with what lab leak proponents rant about, like a WIV-linked research proposal called defuse. Experts state that it is scientifically implausible for SARS coronavirus 2 to have been derived from the genome elements in the chimeric backbone or proposed spike protein. The similarity just is not there. The consensus is entirely with proximal origins lead author, immunologist Christian Anderson, that defuse wouldn't make SARS coronavirus 2. The research focus did not change, and they had not proposed to insert furin cleavage sites into novel bat coronaviruses. This is specifically debunking Matt Ridley, the lab leak propagandist and climate change denier that I've debunked several times as well. In summary, there is no evidence that the WIV used diffuse to shift their research to viruses that could be made into SARS coronavirus 2. Beyond simply demonstrating the total lack of evidence, the idea that such a thing could be pinned on an individual like Fauci is ridiculous. Experts that have no affiliation whatsoever with Fauci wrote papers debunking lab leak, which I discuss in my other video. Much of this was published before proximal origins. That should have made Jay confident that Fauci didn't fund a lab leak, since Jay said it matters when independent peer-reviewed research agrees. Independent teams arrive at different answers to the same questions all the time, so when everyone is in agreement, that's powerful, no? In desperately denigrating published science, he ends up weakening the case for lab leak. Here's Jay and Ridley whining about stupid science that hurts their feelings.
If they really thought the rest of the world was wrong on that, get out there and debate it and so on, and have the conversation. Instead of which they seem to want to use their privileged position as the premier journals to defend one side of an argument, but not engage in it with the other side. And that doesn't feel to me right. There's too much power with these journal editors, yes.
I mean, I think this is partly why I've been so interested in introducing replication as the standard of scientific truth. I mean, I'm not introducing it. This is what all we scientists believe are the standard of scientific truth, right? Independent people looking at the same question come to the same conclusion. That's always been our standard of truth.
When Ridley is talking, you can almost see and hear Graham Hancock, am I right? Why don't the stupid ivory tower elites engage with my super awesome ideas? When, of course, they do. They debunk them, which hurts his feelings. But of course, like the hypocrite that he is, Jay accused Fauci of a cover-up using defused tripe, totally lacking replication and peer review. Illusion of Consensus podcast. They sound like fucking young Earth creationists. Fauci tried to squash lab leak, just like those stupid materialist atheist scientists try to squash intelligent design propaganda. I mean science. No difference. But of course, Fauci wasn't involved in funding Defuse, since Defuse was unfunded. Far from some kind of cover-up, Proximal Origins authors showed data that initially was compatible with engineering, and then upon gathering more evidence, they realized that engineering was unlikely. Anderson cites this specifically with regards to emails between himself and Fauci. Features of the virus were at first considered potentially engineered. That's the furin cleavage site, receptor binding domain, and a restriction enzyme site. RATG13 and other related viruses were later isolated and found to have these features. Extensive genomic analysis made engineering look exceptionally unlikely. This is rarely even mentioned by lab leak propagandists. The experts who were doing the investigating came to the table open-minded regarding engineered versus natural origin. They did a bunch of science which led them to natural origin. But of course, lab leak trolls simply quote mine messages from before experts looked at significant evidence in order to evade what experts said after examining more evidence. For example, in his most recent campaign against Fauci with the diary stuff, Rand and many others showed a January 2020 message from Fauci saying that the first known SARS coronavirus 2 infection was not linked with an animal market, the likely site of zoonosis. Now we know the market was not the source, it was the amplifier. Open and shut, right? Well, Rand didn't mention that later evidence did show that the first known infection was linked to the market. He's just quote mining something from before sufficient investigation was complete. Subsequent epidemiological analysis post-dated multiple cases in workers at the market, making a female seafood vendor there the earliest known case, with illness onset on December 10th. By this dogshit logic, I can say that profiteer Rand never declared that his wife made money off the pandemic threat he downplayed, since Rand didn't declare that in 2020. Sounds like the threat of a pandemic isn't denied in private when there's money to be made, huh? Lab leak trolls also lie about private messages to pretend Proximal Origins authors and Fauci worked in a cover-up. Some bullshit about having a handler. For example, they lie about Christian evaluating evidence from after his paper, evidence that never turns out to show a lab leak. Matt Ridley simply quote-mined Christian discussing Josh Rogan's debunked story of a WIV laboratory incident. Josh is a troll who appears on CNN and other media to promote lab leak and trash Fauci, and is allergic to admitting when he's been proven wrong. But here's Christian debunking a story Rogan tells.
He's talking about April here, and at that time, the Washington Post had reported there were secret cables out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which showed that there had been, unsafe practices and there had been accidents and things like that. And that is what I'm reacting to here in private messaging among, scientists here, where I say like, but wait a minute, might we actually have been wrong in our earlier conclusions, which is exactly what I'm saying here, right? But of course, what we realized was that those cables were not actually anything to do with unsafe practices or lab leaks at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, right? It just had to do with very basic maintenance of what happens in virology labs.
Easy to understand how reality was distorted in this scenario. As you can see, only gullible sheep believe lab leak trolls who distort experts' private messages and diaries, including Fauci's. Christian also explained how Fauci hadn't directed them to write a paper disproving lab leak claims. They were prompted to look at the important question of COVID origins. This is what scientists do. They examine all possibilities. It doesn't take much to see that Fauci was open to going wherever the data led. Here's an email from February 2020 sent from Fauci to Jeremy Farrar, who was then at World Health Organization, relaying early concerns from Christian about the furin cleavage site, back when such a motif had not yet been found in related viruses. Get more scientists together to look at the data. If they agree with Christian's concerns, tell the authorities. Fauci himself was investigating engineered versus natural origins. Everyone was. That's how scientists operate. How does any of this make sense? Any of this research and correspondence in the context of Fauci plotting to cover up a lab leak? Well, that didn't stop part-time surfing instructor Tulsi Gabbard from spewing a bunch of bullshit when she released some files as Director of National Intelligence. Check this shit out.
Before the COVID pandemic, Dr. Fauci, as head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, provided millions in U.S. taxpayer dollars to fund dangerous gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, work which is now widely viewed as the source of the unintentional lab leak that sparked the pandemic. Now, in support of President Trump's maximum transparency mandate, today, on my final day as Director of National Intelligence, I'm releasing never-before-seen communications and documents that expose exactly how Fauci worked with politicized career leadership in the intelligence community to suppress the truth about his actions, the virus's lab leak origins, and his role in directing U.S. funding for this dangerous research that caused immeasurable harm and countless lost lives.
Gotta love that push in for dramatic effect, right? So yeah, this was part of her pattern of misrepresenting intelligence documents to attack Trump's perceived enemies. The claim is that she revealed intelligence showing the WIV had SARS coronavirus 2 or a precursor. This is an easy claim to make. Just put what you want people to believe in the headline, use the word declassified to make it sound real juicy, and then just dump a bunch of documents knowing almost nobody will read them. Tulsi has a history of doing this. In reality, the documents said nothing of the sort. No such intelligence. Same with a report from Tulsi's office. These files showed how Fauci noted ways to check for lab leak and zoonosis and suggested experts to consult, including ones that intelligence groups had met or already planned to meet. None of this shit is incriminating in the slightest. Document after document. No cover-up. So what the fuck is she rambling about exactly?
First, Dr. Fauci funded dangerous gain-of-function coronavirus research linked to Big Pharma and their pursuit of universal vaccines worth trillions of dollars.
Yeah, just dropping Big Pharma for no reason doesn't mean anything, and there was no gain-of-function research.
Second, Dr. Fauci was the behind-the-scenes advisor who, alongside his hand-picked so-called experts, pushed the intelligence community to endorse a natural animal origin to hide his dangerous gain-of-function research that he funded using taxpayer dollars, all of this in a deliberate attempt to cover up the truth and shift the blame and attention away from Fauci's own actions.
No, scientists were examining both possibilities, and evidence pushed them towards natural origin, which only became further and further corroborated with every bit of virological and epidemiological evidence that was collected. And again, there was no gain-of-function research.
Third, Dr. Fauci became the nation's pandemic pundit, and he publicly pushed lies, disinformation, and censorship using every platform available.
You mean he was a scientist who defended science every time he was dragged in front of Congress countless times to deal with baseless accusations from Rand Paul and other lying frauds? Of course, Rand insisted that CIA whistleblower James Erdman showed that Fauci covered up China's lab leak. CIA stuff, super cool. Whistleblower awesomeness, bro. What a fucking tool. This is the Trump administration. Say literally whatever the fuck you want. Make up any story you want out of thin air. Say it loudly and repeatedly, and most people will believe you. When credible voices show up to speak the truth, attack them, slander them, call them the deep state, threaten their safety until they shut the fuck up, and nobody will be the wiser. Honestly, I'm not sure where people got the idea that anyone should be trusting the CIA in the first place. Remember the debunked lab leak claims about sick WIV staff? Remember the debunked WMD claims in Iraq? Always the same shit. Everyone knows the CIA is constantly enacting psyops for covert action and political influence, to shape foreign policy opinion, to destabilize rival governments, but suddenly we have to listen to them about the cause of a global pandemic? Who falls for this shit? US intelligence also spread anti-vax disinformation about China's COVID-19 vaccine to get back at Chinese officials for saying SARS coronavirus 2 came from a USA lab in Fort Detrick. They were running the same play over there. U.S. intelligence has a motive to baselessly accuse adversaries, so they're far from the arbiters of truth. And even if one were to believe U.S. intelligence, which agency specifically? Most U.S. intelligence agencies say zoonosis is more likely than lab leak. A Department of Defense review likewise said allegations about defuse were unsubstantiated. Also, supposed CIA whistleblower Erdman has no expertise on pathogen origins and is totally unreliable on SARS coronavirus 2. He's a COVID-19 anti-vaxxer who deleted his claims after Rand endorsed him. He fell for tripe like the furin cleavage sequence being engineered from work patented by Moderna. He based that on a refuted calculation of the probability of that sequence existing naturally. The sequence is instead found in many places, like bats, viruses, and bacteria. This illustrates Erdman's paranoid incompetence when it comes to the origins of the pandemic. So, of course, he pretended it was somehow a cover-up when Fauci brought in experts. How the fuck is that a cover-up? A cover-up would involve insulation, exclude experts, craft the narrative out of thin air and stick with it. This is like an anti-vaxxer pretending it's a cover-up when vaccine experts appear. Yes, anyone repeating shit like this is dumber than rocks. And speaking of people who are dumber than rocks, it's time to move on to some of the dumbest talking points we will cover, those regarding transmission and masks. In March of 2020, experts at Fauci's Institute noted risk of SARS coronavirus 2 airborne transmission by aerosols. Aerosols are suspensions of airborne liquid or particles. They come out of your mouth when you cough or sneeze, but also to a lesser extent when you just talk or breathe. This is how viral particles are transmitted, since this material can come from the respiratory tract. Transmission also happens by droplets larger than aerosols, which are unable to travel as far through the air due to increased mass. In April of 2020, experts defended the plausibility of airborne transmission using work Fauci co-authored. Fauci acknowledged aerosol transmission in interviews after more evidence accumulated for it. His language was always measured, reflective of the certainty of the data available at the time, and always insistent on further research. So Jay was dead wrong when he said epidemiologists, scientists, and public health experts all spoke with one voice. We must act as if the disease is spread primarily by droplets and on surfaces. This led to one of the most pathetic and deliberate distortions of Fauci, the whole 6 feet social distancing thing, and people pretending there was no basis for it. It was shown that 6 feet between people reduced transmission risk, including by large droplets. This was based on a systematic review of 172 studies. And it cites the fact that 1 meter is good, but 2 meters is better. 6 feet is 2 meters. That's called a unit conversion. That's where this number comes from. Fauci noted there wasn't yet a clinical trial following people forward in time to see which separation distance was best. Congressional Republicans pretended this meant a 6 feet rule wasn't based on science, should have been removed, and that droplet transmission didn't happen. In other words, frauds took some nuance regarding the arrival on the specific value of 6 feet and distorted it to pretend that there was no scientific basis for social distancing, which is fucking insane. Viruses are transmitted by aerosol droplets. If people don't get right next to each other within the range of typical aerosols, they are very unlikely to transmit the virus. It's not that hard to understand. But anti-science propaganda peddling frauds have no interest in understanding. That's why Fauci's critics distorted the type of uncertainty being described, from a specific distance to any distance at all. It'd be like Trump saying there should be no age of consent until the best age is determined. If we can't agree on the specific age, then no consent is necessary and all kids are fair game, right? Not so much of a hypothetical in this instance, but you get the idea. Besides social distancing, Fauci discussed using masks to limit transmission by redirecting and blocking droplets and aerosols. Some argued Fauci intentionally underestimated mask efficacy to secretly save masks for healthcare workers. This criticism was actually debunked by Fauci critic Vinay Prasad, who used to be Trump's lead vaccine regulator at the FDA. This is what critics like Zeynep Tufekci said. Confusion is understandable, but experts explain the logic. Sick people with symptoms transmit, and healthcare workers are most exposed to sick people. In early March 2020, Fauci said healthcare staff and people with symptoms should wear masks, but not everyone should wear them. But he said he wasn't against people wearing masks if they wanted. He was explicit about this.
There's a lot of confusion among people and misinformation surrounding face masks. Can you discuss that?
The masks are important for someone who's infected to prevent them from infecting someone else. Now, when you see people and look at the films in China and South Korea, whatever, everybody's wearing a mask. Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks. But when you think masks, you should think of healthcare providers needing them and people who are ill. The people who, when you look at the films of foreign countries and you see 85% of the people wearing masks, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not against it. If you want to do it, that's fine.
This was March 8th, 2020. This was before COVID was declared a global pandemic and before a national emergency was declared. Once the American population was sufficiently infected, then it became common sense for everyone to wear masks in public to minimize transmission. Like Fauci, the UK's chief medical advisor and the WHO said healthcare workers and people with symptoms needed masks. Their mask recommendation extended to more people as mask supply increased and with more evidence on transmission by people who lacked symptoms. This is shown by science journalist and friend to the channel Peter Hadfield in his debunk of myths about the WHO.
So right from the start of the outbreak, the WHO recommended the use of masks for people with symptoms and healthcare workers because they do work. They didn't recommend it for the general population at that time because the supply of masks was limited. That was the same advice given by the CDC and the UK's chief medical advisor for the same reasons. As more masks became available and the asymptomatic spread of SARS-CoV-2 was discovered, the advice changed.
One could make the argument that Fauci could have more strongly recommended masks for more people right then in the first week of March. He reconsidered his position by late March and broadly recommended masks by April 3rd. But there is nothing scandalous here. Nothing about the efficacy of masks is in dispute. It's about how early the entire population needed to mask, weighing in the factors of how many were infected and what the supply of masks looked like. As those variables changed, the recommendation changed. This is common sense. Others objected to Fauci's mask advocacy and to mask mandates by saying a Cochrane review showed masks don't work. This is total horseshit. Cochrane's editor-in-chief even debunked that herself. Later research showed masks work, like this 2023 paper. A 2024 paper performed a systematic review and meta-analysis of mask studies, concluding masks are, if correctly and consistently worn, effective in reducing transmission. That debunks Rand's claim that Fauci lied when he said masks work. Of course they fucking work. Viral particles are transmitted by aerosol droplets, and the masks block the droplets. This isn't fucking rocket science. They're not magic, but it's an absolutely trivial point of protocol that dramatically reduces transmission, and anyone who was being a baby about masks contributed to a social trend that killed people. End of story. Fauci was never out of line or wishy-washy on masks or transmission. He was responsible, cited evidence, and changed his recommendations in sensible ways as variables changed. Moving on now to SARS coronavirus 2 risk and risk factors. Very early on, Fauci saw very little risk from SARS coronavirus 2, but he said more evidence could change that. In terms of risk, viruses can have high fatality rates like Ebola or spread well like the measles virus, rarely both, given the need for an alive host to transmit. By early February 2020, Fauci said SARS coronavirus 2 was very transmissible and would very likely cause a pandemic. He later noted that SARS coronavirus 2 was more transmissible than seasonal influenza. Fauci's transmissibility claim was confirmed by SARS coronavirus 2's reproduction number, or R, of around 3. That's not as bad as the measles virus, but higher than Ebola, and more than twice influenza's R value. This meant that someone infected with SARS coronavirus 2 would, on average, infect more than twice as many people as an influenza-infected person if no one was immune. That's transmission risk. Everything he said early on was strictly data-driven and expressed with an appropriate level of uncertainty. For fatality risk, infection fatality rate, or IFR, is the proportion of infected people that die from infection. Not all infections are detected as reported cases due to factors like less testing of infected people who lack symptoms. So IFR is less than the proportion of cases that die from infection. That is called case fatality rate, or CFR. CFR equals IFR when CFR includes all symptomatic and asymptomatic infections, meaning all infections. IFR can be calculated by testing a sample of the population for antibodies that increase after infection. The percentage with antibodies is called seroprevalence, which approximates the infection rate. Multiplying that infection rate by population gives total infections. Total COVID-19 deaths divided by total infections is IFR. The sample tested should be representative of the general population, or it could display sample bias. For example, polling the political views of wealthy people may not be representative of the general population's views. So accurate polls randomly select members members of the population to ensure that each person has an equal probability of selection, regardless of wealth or other traits. Seroprevalence studies can likewise randomly select people for testing to get a representative sample for calculating IFR. For IFR, in late February 2020, Fauci presented a hypothetical where it could be considerably less than 1%, closer to seasonal influenza's 0.1%. He voiced uncertainty, but his critics pretended otherwise. Here's a ridiculous nitpicker. When speaking more definitively in March, he said around 1% IFR for the USA and 2 to 3% for China. So that's greater fatality risk and greater transmission risk than for seasonal influenza. He expressed this very clearly when testifying in Congress.
The seasonal flu that we deal with every year has a mortality of 0.1%. The stated mortality overall of this, when you look at all the data, including China, is about 3%. It first started off as 2 and now 3. I think if you count all the cases of minimally symptomatic or asymptomatic infection, that probably brings the mortality rate down to somewhere around 1%, which means it is 10 times more lethal than the seasonal flu. I think that's something that people can get their arms around and understand.
Fauci's 1% USA IFR was consistent with 0.8% from Neal's unmitigated projection of 2.2 million deaths and 270 million infections. Yet shit-stained Jay pretended Neal's Imperial College model and all experts, including Fauci, exaggerated risk by assuming 2 or 3 out of 100 infected people die. But Jay lied, since in May 2020, he cited a 0.9% Great Britain IFR from Neal's March report.
I want to focus your attention on the 0.9 infection fatality rate. That's different. The IFR 0.9, that's different actually than the infection fatality rate of 0.9 that's different than the case fatality rate that I just showed you, the World Health Organization and the Chinese CDC.
A February 2020 WHO report gave an IFR range of 0.3% to 1%, again refuting Jay. Fauci's 1% was in that range, matching a national seroprevalence study with random sampling. So he was right about USA IFR. The physician F. Perry Wilson further confirmed this by noting an IFR of around 0.8% or 0.9% using several statewide seroprevalence studies with random sampling. All Fauci ever did was report what the research was showing. He never overstated or understated anything. He was reporting scientific consensus, which is all we ever have to go on. Anything else is politics. To be fair, Fauci did make minor mistakes. He said influenza IFR was 0.1% when it was slightly less than 0.1%, and his 2 to 3% estimate for China was a little too high. Chinese seroprevalence data actually implied IFRs closer to his 1% USA IFR, so 4.43% seroprevalence in Wuhan implied IFR of 0.8%. Fauci's 2 to 3% IFR for China instead better applied to other locations. In Osaka, Japan, for example, roughly 2% IFR was implied by 4,290 infections and 86 deaths through June 2020. IFRs shown so far used reported COVID-19 deaths, but there are unreported COVID-19 deaths that cause IFR underestimation, like unreported infections that cause CFR to exceed IFR. COVID-19 may not be recognized as the cause of death due to factors like doctors not present to diagnose people. Fauci knew this and correctly acknowledged unreported COVID-19 deaths. He thus countered Trump's lie that CDC exaggerated COVID-19 deaths, as this was the opposite of reality. Yet, as Peter noted, many Republican lemmings parroted Trump's lie that influenza posed a greater mortality risk. Hadfield again explains this succinctly.
When people are forced to choose between believing a politician they like and a scientist they don't know, they'll often go with the politician and reject the science. That's why only 40% of Republicans who trusted the president thought the worst was yet to come, as opposed to 80% of Democrats. And here's the problem with that. When people believe their president's claim that the virus is no worse than the flu, and it's already been stopped, and they see him shaking hands and holding rallies, they become complacent. They lose any concern about catching it or passing it on.
If I get corona, I get corona. At the end of the day, I'm not going to let it stop me from partying.
Party on, dude. This rhetoric from the Donald undeniably killed a lot of people. Anyway, death underreporting can be addressed by using excess deaths, or deaths above the expected number. Excess deaths correlated with, and often exceeded, reported COVID-19 deaths. That's consistent with using excess deaths to detect unreported deaths, as noted in a WHO paper. Here's that WHO analysis correlating excess deaths with reported COVID-19 deaths in the USA. Excess deaths in black correlated with, but exceed, reported COVID-19 deaths in light brown. One can then compare IFR calculations using reported COVID-19 deaths versus excess deaths. Purple dots use reported deaths and blue use excess deaths. Nations in the left two columns were less successful before the pandemic in reporting cause of death, while those in the right two columns were more successful. Excess deaths increased IFR estimates in the left half, but not the right. This further supports using excess deaths to detect unreported COVID-19 deaths, consistent with Fauci's claim. China's IFR is around 0.5% in the fourth column, below Fauci's 2 to 3%. Excess deaths implied Fauci's 2 to 3% IFR was too high for China, but not for other nations, including the USA, particularly early on. He also noted risk factors, correctly saying in March 2020 that comorbidities and age increased risk. Here he is explaining all of this to JAMA Network on March 6th of 2020.
In which, if you look at the mortality according to age and then according to underlying comorbidities, it's so clear, Howard, that the overwhelming weight of serious disease and mortality is in those individuals who are elderly as well as comorbidity. Heart disease, chronic lung disease, diabetes, obesity, respiratory difficulties with asthma, etc.
So Fauci gave the public facts on age-specific risk and IFR, contrary to claims from HHS head Bobby Kennedy, who wrote an entire fucking book slandering Fauci like a little baby. In addition to noting lower risk for younger people, Fauci acknowledged there was still significant risk to kids and recommended kids be vaccinated. He was right about this risk. He was right on all accounts. SARS coronavirus 2 hospitalized and killed more kids than many other vaccine-preventable infections. Mitigation policies slowed SARS coronavirus 2 transmission, but slowed influenza even more. This was one of the funniest talking points from idiots who wondered why influenza infections went down in the early pandemic, as though social distancing and masking are supposed to magically only minimize coronavirus transmission and not all viruses. Indeed, there was minimal influenza activity for the 2020-2021 flu season. SARS coronavirus 2 still spread to kids because of greater transmissibility than influenza, as Fauci warned. Yet Jay, Martin, and epidemiologist Sunetra Gupta, as we know, all co-authored the Great Barrington Declaration, or GBD, which falsely said, for children, COVID-19 is less dangerous than influenza. These piece-of-shit sellouts lied through their teeth to misrepresent risk, to then undercut support for government interventions like school closures, totally in service of the desired state narrative. Fauci instead aptly discussed not only infection harm, but also infection-induced immunity, always by the book, always following the research, and never caving in to baseless narratives like the Trump administration. Let's move on to infection-induced herd immunity in 2020, or immunity from everyone just getting infected by the virus. Fauci's critics lied about infection-induced immunity, or natural immunity as they called it. Gotta use that buzzword natural for good PR, right? Jay said Neal's modeling and all experts, including Fauci, assumed no immunity after infection. Jay lied since in May 2020, he cited Neal's March report that assumed immunity after infection in the short term. On April 1st, Fauci likewise correctly said that infection-induced immunity prevented reinfection, without saying how long protection lasts. Experts modeled the impact of that protection. In this image, blue people are susceptible to infection, red are infected and contagious, and yellow are completely resistant to being infected. The top row shows a naive population, meaning almost no one is resistant. Moving from the left to middle and then right panel shows transmission over time. The population in the bottom row has herd immunity because the proportion of the population resistant to infection exceeds a herd immunity threshold, or HIT. That means enough immune people to block significant transmission and prevent a wave of infections. This immunity can be achieved either through infection or vaccination, with the obvious drawback of infection being that people can get sick and die and also infect other people. Either way, when HIT is reached, infections per unit time start decreasing, equivalent to an infection wave peaking on a graph of new infections versus time. HIT is thus less than the proportion of the population infected when the outbreak ends. So HIT is like the instant you put your car in neutral, causing the car to start slowing down, not the later time point when the car finally completely stops. In early 2020, experts calculated HIT that was defined by 1 minus 1 over R0. Larger R0 means more transmissibility, and more of the population needs to be resistant to infection for herd immunity to be achieved. The 3.15 R0 shown earlier implies a HIT of 0.68 or 68%. Neil's unmitigated scenario used 2.4 R0, implying a 58% HIT and 81% infected at the outbreak's end. In April 2020, Fauci expressed uncertainty with a HIT range from 40% to over 85%. He explained this to Time magazine in April of 2020.
Protect the people within the herd who are not immune. That's why they call it herd immunity. Now, the problem is that depending upon the efficiency of transmissibility, the percentage of people that need to be protected, i.e. already infected and protected, varies from infection to infection. It could be 40%, 50%, it might even be as high as 80, 85% or more. There are two ways that you get herd immunity. You get enough people infected who are then ultimately immune and thus protected, and or you get a vaccine that induces immunity. I mean, the perfect form of herd immunity is a vaccine that's 97% protective. I mean, to me, that's the epitome of herd immunity. But sometimes you need a combination of the two.
Herd immunity is defined under typical behavior for a given time of year to distinguish between decreased transmission from immunity versus from behavior changes and policy interventions. Many lockdown opponents distorted this crucial point. Just the way that cars can slow down for reasons besides being in neutral, such as brakes, waves can peak and subside for reasons besides herd immunity, such as voluntary behavior changes or government restrictions. Turning off brakes with the car in neutral won't speed up the car, like ending restrictions and behavior changes with herd immunity won't cause a wave. That motivated lockdown opponents like Rand to claim a HIT of 22% or less by falsely assuming that first waves peaking meant herd immunity had been achieved. This implied that most people wouldn't be infected if everyone behaved like there was no pandemic with no government restrictions. Like a stubborn toddler, he refused to listen to Fauci, who knew better due to his immunology and infectious disease research. This is an exchange between them from September of 2020.
Right now, if you look at what's going on right now, the things that are going on in New York to get their test positivity 1% or less is because they are looking at the guidelines that we have put together from the task force of the 4 or 5 things of masks, social distancing, outdoors more than indoors, avoiding crowds, and washing hands.
Or they've developed enough community immunity that they're no longer having the pandemic because they have enough immunity in New York City to actually stop.
I challenge that, Senator, because I want to, please, sir, I would like to be able to do this because this happens with Senator Rand all the time. You were not listening to what the director of the CDC said, that in New York, it's about 22%. If you believe 22% is herd immunity, I believe you're alone in that.
God, I wish I could be the anger translator in situations like this. Rand, you dumb piece of shit. Anyone who thinks 22% infected constitutes herd immunity is a fucking moron. Infections went down because people started doing all the shit I just said. Everyone can wrap their head around that, right? At any rate, in June 2020, Neil agreed with Fauci that herd immunity hadn't been achieved, not in any country. But Rand used GBD author Sunetra to say some cities may have reached herd immunity after their first wave. What do you know? The government shill pushing the anti-lockdown narrative is pulling things out of his ass. Nobody saw that coming. In effect, Rand and others said not to worry about another wave thanks to herd immunity, which led to idiots being reckless, which led to lots of people dying. It's one thing to claim herd immunity after 2021, when less people were susceptible because more folks had some immunity from vaccination and/or infection. But this was mid-2020 when the vast majority of people lacked immunity. To call this irresponsible is an understatement. Language like this objectively killed people. This reckless rhetoric spread among many lockdown opponents who didn't give two shits about people dying as long as their profits were not diminished. They especially liked applying it to Sweden since they thought Sweden didn't have a lockdown. So in July 2020, Jay said, "There's some places where I think we've reached herd immunity, actually. I would be very surprised if there was a second resurgence in New York. Sweden, they've reached herd immunity there." Rand spread this idea in September. In October, Sunetra said New York City and London wouldn't have another large surge. Of course, we now know that Jay, Sunetra, and Rand were wrong since more waves then happened, showing there wasn't herd immunity. New York's surges debunked these three asshats while clearly supporting Fauci's warning. Waves in London refuted Sunetra and Rand, while Sweden's waves debunked Rand and Jay. All the places they mentioned, not a single one had anything even remotely resembling herd immunity, and they all experienced pronounced subsequent spikes of infection. So Jay's collaborator, infectious disease physician Aaron Ben-David, had to admit he and Jay were wrong.
We would be able to reduce transmission quite a bit. I underappreciated the virus transmissibility. I thought by the end of the fall or the winter of, the fall or the summer of 2020, when things looked like they were kind of stable, I thought we'd reached immunologic control. I didn't expect things to sort of keep going as they did.
As you can see, lockdown opponents like Jay and Sunetra built a dangerous, focused protection strategy around failed claims of infection-induced herd immunity. Fauci was the winner here, as usual. Now let's talk about the lockdowns themselves. Every podcast bro refers to these as some kind of Orwellian measures from the deep state, as though a federal government should do literally nothing to protect its citizens from a global pandemic. Fauci advocated for a national lockdown in the first wave, but said it could be avoided in the second if other sufficient mitigation measures were put in place, like masking and social distancing. He understood that vaccines would eventually arrive and that precautions had to take place in the meantime. He could only make recommendations since he had no legal power to mandate. States decide policy. He noted competing interests like preventing transmission versus lost pay and racial justice protests. These are all variables to consider. In July 2020, HHS officials Paul Alexander and Michael Caputo instead discussed removing restrictions on the less vulnerable to achieve herd immunity. Paul said, "We want them infected." Kind of sinister sounding, don't you think? In October 2020, the GBD advocated a similar focused protection strategy. This focused interventions on the vulnerable while removing restrictions on the less vulnerable in a manner permitting more transmission and infection-induced immunity. HHS head Alex Azar embraced this strategy in October 2020 after meeting with the GBD's authors. This strategy had many problems. For example, it let SARS coronavirus 2 infect more and replicate more, increasing the chance that more transmissible and deadly variants would arise. In October 2020, Fauci said this strategy would cause transmission to the more vulnerable, more infections, more deaths, more mutations, more variants, all bad stuff.
That again is another trap, because when you talk about the Great Barrington Declaration, what they say in there and then what is implied are two different things. They say, A, we need to protect the vulnerable. I totally agree with that. No problem. That's apple pie and motherhood. The other thing is that you don't want to lock down or close down the country. I certainly agree with that. I just said that. But in there is the implication that if you just let anybody get and everybody get infected, don't wear masks, let children get infected, let everybody get infected, and just protect the vulnerable, like being really careful in nursing homes and places like that. That doesn't work, because in our community, there's maybe a third of the population, depending upon how you figure it, that are vulnerable and would be prone to getting serious complications from COVID-19 disease. It is impossible, and we've never protected those people in the community. They're not in nursing homes where you can do things in nursing homes. You have the elderly, obese people, people with underlying conditions like heart disease, diabetes, and other conditions, if you let infections rip, as it were, and say, let everybody get infected that's going to be able to be getting infected, and then we'll have herd immunity, quite frankly, that is nonsense. And anybody who knows anything about epidemiology will tell you that that is nonsense and very dangerous.
As it turned out, nobody in Trump's HHS knew a fucking thing about epidemiology. Anyway, this is all pretty easy to grasp for anyone with a brain. Nobody wanted to lock everything down indefinitely, but what the GBD authors were saying about letting everyone get infected to reach immunity is just fucking insane. It's pure pseudoscience used as the basis to push public policy that deliberately placed private economic interests above human lives. Fauci knows that public health is about both individual and population risk. For example, speed limits protect vulnerable motorcyclists by restricting them and less vulnerable SUV drivers, since drivers hit motorcyclists. Speed limits give some protection to drivers. Likewise, lockdowns protect the more vulnerable, such as the elderly, by restricting them, and the less vulnerable non-elderly, since the young infect the old, and we all suffer when more are infected. Lockdowns give protection to the young and healthy as well. The GBD is like saying speed limits should only apply to motorcyclists, not SUV drivers. Fauci stated this again in 2024.
Herd immunity was very elusive with COVID, and the Great Barrington Declaration was flawed both conceptually and in practice. Conceptually, that you could shield vulnerable people as if the only vulnerable people are those in nursing homes. We have tens and tens of millions of vulnerable people that you couldn't possibly shield. People with underlying conditions, the elderly, those would be the individuals. So it would be conceptually impossible to do that. Herd immunity, as we know, means if you have a virus that doesn't change and a virus in which when you get infected or vaccinated, you have highly durable, perhaps lifelong immunity. That's not the case with COVID. We know immunity wanes and we have multiple variants. So in practical purposes, the Great Barrington Declaration was invalid, both conceptually and practically.
The GBD, the state-sanctioned pseudoscience narrative, is being declared invalid by Fauci. This is equivalent to saying the government is lying to you. Is it really so hard to grasp why Fauci has been so relentlessly targeted by Trump and his cronies? At any rate, seroprevalence data supported Fauci's point. For example, more infection of younger people correlated with a greater proportion of older people infected. This increased average fatality and hospitalization rates from infection, IFR and IHR respectively, since risk increases with age. Higher population-wide infection rates also predicted higher infection rates in vulnerable nursing home residents. That's because staff that gets infected outside the nursing home can then infect the residents. Same with hospitals. Sweden's COVID-19 Commission also noted that transmission in Sweden's general population placed vulnerable nursing home residents at risk. Sweden thus confirmed Fauci's point, totally undermining Rand's narrative about Sweden's first wave policies, a narrative Fauci rejected.
Do you have any second thoughts about your mitigation recommendations, considering the evidence that despite all of the things we've done in the U.S., our death rate is essentially worse than Sweden, equivalent to the less developed world that is unable to do any of the things that you've been promoting? Do you have any second thoughts? Are you willing to look at the data that countries that did very little actually have a lower death rate than the United States?
You know, Senator, I'd be happy at a different time to sit down and go over detail. You've said a lot of different things. You've compared us to Sweden, and there are a lot of differences. And you said, well, you know, there are a lot of differences between Sweden, but compare Sweden's death rate to other comparable Scandinavian countries. It's worse. So I don't think it's appropriate to compare Sweden with us.
After the first wave, Fauci's counterpart in Sweden, epidemiologist Anders Tegnell, admitted that their first wave policy should have been more like the rest of the world, and thus closer to Fauci's suggestions. Then COVID-19 caused a second wave of deaths in Sweden that was much larger than that of its Nordic neighbors. This further debunked what Rand fabricated about Sweden's first wave response, while vindicating Fauci's concerns. On top of that, Sweden's king criticized their earlier policies. Because of this, Sweden instituted stricter responses during their second wave than during their first wave. These second wave policies were about as strict or even stricter than their Nordic neighbors and the USA. For instance, public events were limited to 50 people in the first wave, but to only 8 in the second wave. Kinda funny how Rand praises Sweden for being so awesome in their COVID response when Swedish officials themselves admit that they completely fucked up and should have done essentially what Fauci recommended, huh? At any rate, there were additional interventions in this second wave, such as closing non-essential services, remote or distant learning in upper secondary schools, and a mask recommendation like Fauci's. So, Anders said, in many aspects, Sweden has a virtual lockdown, although less forced. Similar policies, like canceling gatherings, occurred during the 1918 influenza pandemic. Public places were closed down, and cities that enforced social distancing fared better. These policies were also recommended in a 2016 U.S. preparedness plan, matching Fauci's first wave suggestions. 2014 Ebola virus response in affected nations, such as Sierra Leone, also involved lockdown, school closures, and more, despite Ebola virus killing way less people than SARS coronavirus 2 due to being less transmissible. All of this is to say that anyone who thinks Fauci made some kind of unprecedented draconian recommendations is an idiot. Pandemic plans varied based on the pathogen risk. For fatality risk, USA IFR was at least about 1%. For transmission risk, R was greater than 1.8. Household secondary attack rate, a measure of household transmission, also exceeded 20%, especially for later variants. That meant SARS coronavirus 2 had moderate to high transmissibility and severity, based on a 2017 CDC pandemic preparedness plan Fauci likely knew about. So, severity would be in the upper right quadrant beyond all modern influenza pandemics, other than the worst one from 1918. Excess mortality confirmed this, even with improved medical care limiting COVID-19 excess deaths compared to excess deaths from earlier pandemics. The 2017 plan's recommendations for a moderate to high pandemic like COVID-19 matched Fauci's first wave recommendations. Canada's pre-2020 plan also matched Fauci's lockdown guidance, as did Austria's and others. Those plans and Fauci's suggestions were vindicated by lockdowns correlating with fewer excess deaths, including fewer deaths from infectious disease. This wasn't a coincidence, since lockdowns limit social contact by which pathogens spread, as shown in research Peter Hadfield discussed.
When I looked for other studies in Lancet-owned journals and in the Lancet itself, they all reached the opposite conclusion. They all concluded that lockdowns reduced rates of infection. Some showed that the stricter lockdown measures were, the more effective they were. And they showed that when the strictest lockdown measures were lifted, infection rates began to rise again. Picking one study from the Lancet group that supports your case and ignoring all the others that don't is called cherry picking.
So sound reasoning, planning, and prior outbreaks supported Fauci's lockdown recommendation. In August 2022, Jay still criticized lockdowns by saying New Zealand's lockdown decreased and delayed COVID-19 deaths at the expense of increasing non-COVID-19 deaths. Jay's own source contradicted him by showing no substantial number of non-COVID-19 excess deaths, and that cumulative excess deaths were negative, so fewer people died than expected based on prior years. New Zealand's policy pushed infections later to when better treatments and vaccines reduced fatality rates. Hence, Fauci acknowledging lockdowns were needed in places like New Zealand, while noting that lockdown benefits are weighed against side effects like harm to the economy. That's why lockdowns are only done for very dangerous outbreaks like COVID-19 and Ebola. Fauci explains more.
Because some people interpret the public health measures, which early on did require shutting down, the way many countries, including New Zealand and ourselves, did. We didn't do it as much as people thought we did, if you looked at really how much we shut down. But nonetheless, it has hurt the economy. So the response is that the health attempts and the health methodologies have hurt people. Therefore, they're bad. No, it's the virus that's bad, not the health efforts that have done it. So what we've got to do is get people to realize that it isn't a political issue where some people feel it's good to do this and other people feel it's bad to do this. if done in the appropriate way, the public health methodologies, the mask wearing, the physical distancing, the avoiding crowds, the washing hands, that should be interpreted as the gateway and the roadway to reopening the economy.
If anyone wants to criticize Fauci on his pronunciation of the word interpreted, I'll give them a pass on that one. That's all I can find so far. Anyway, the results of COVID-19 policy further vindicated Fauci's objections to the GBD, which was nothing but political theater. In October 2020, the GBD's page said 3 to 6 months of focused protection would achieve herd immunity. The GBD page used Sweden as its example, falsely claiming that all other nations ditched their plans. Yet the GBD's definition of lockdown includes Sweden's schools and universities that are closed for in-person teaching, hybrid schools, and restrictions on sports and cultural events. But even pretending that the GBD was right about Sweden using focused protection, Sweden's second wave refuted the GBD's prediction of herd immunity within 6 months. So in November, GBD author Jay shifted the goalposts to predicting no spike in deaths per capita, aka mortality rate. The increased mortality rate in Sweden's second wave again debunked Jay and justified Fauci's concerns. Jay and Martin also said that Florida adopted the GBD's focused protection recommendation, which is just another way of saying that Florida is full of people who don't give two shits about a dangerous pandemic. But Florida's infection waves again refuted the GBD's prediction of herd immunity within 6 months. The data is in. It's over. Fauci was correct to reject focused protection. Geneticist Francis Collins, Jay's predecessor as NIH head, was also right to criticize the GBD and ask Fauci to share a rebuttal of it. GBD proponents tried to paint this as an attempt to silence some brave rebel truth-tellers, but it was really just honest scientists pushing back against pseudoscience that kills people. Rand tried to fool paranoid, gullible sheep by dishonestly pretending this was an anti-GBD conspiracy. Watch this little weasel try and cook.
In an email exchange with Dr. Collins, you conspire, and I quote here directly from the email, to create a quick and devastating published takedown of 3 prominent epidemiologists from Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford. Apparently there's a lot of fringe epidemiologists at Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford. And you quote in the email that they, or from Dr. Collins, and you agree that they are fringe. And immediately there's this takedown effort. A published takedown, though, doesn't exactly conjure up the image of a dispassionate scientist.
Why the fuck do they have to be dispassionate? Frauds are spreading pseudoscience that kills people. A little passion should be expected. Naming institutions is just a pathetic argument from authority, and that's all Rand's got. Resumes and conspiracy theories, because he doesn't understand a fucking thing about science. Besides that, GBD trolls also fallaciously replace what the Declaration and its website said with easier-to-defend claims Fauci already noted, such as that lockdowns have negative side effects. This is just a retroactive Mott and Bailey meant to rewrite history. Fauci was correct in debunking GBD lies about focused protection. He was right about vaccine-induced protection. He was right about all of it. And he was brave to speak up about it, knowing that the government would come for his head. With focused protection debunked, let's now move on to vaccine-induced herd immunity. Vaccines, once produced and distributed, prevented infection quite successfully, although imperfectly, as shown in a 2022 Cochrane review. Anti-vaxxers love to pretend that prevention requires 100% perfection, which of course it doesn't. 90 to 95% goes quite a long way. It's like pretending that condoms don't stop STI transmission unless they work 100% of the time. Instances in which they fail don't undermine their overwhelming efficacy and protective ability. So when officials whined about vaccines not stopping the virus, they're saying they didn't magically eradicate every last viral particle on the planet. No shit. Some anti-vaxxers even go so far as to pretend that vaccines had no efficacy whatsoever, which is completely fucking insane. Anyone can look at the data demonstrating that once vaccines were distributed, the overwhelming majority of hospitalizations and deaths were among the unvaccinated. At any rate, in December 2020, exercising caution and measured language like absolutely always, Fauci voiced uncertainty on vaccines preventing infection since initial clinical trials hadn't been designed to check for infection prevention, but instead for disease prevention. Here he is in December of 2020, just as phase 3 trials for early vaccines were concluding and the data could first be evaluated.
The question is, A, we don't know yet. Hopefully data in a longer term follow-up or subsequent trials will determine whether or not you have a significant inhibition of actual infection.
In January 2021, Fauci continued advocating for mitigation policies alongside vaccination, since their combination would obviously be the most effective. By May 2021, he accepted that vaccines imperfectly prevented infection and transmission given numerous variables, but still strongly advocated for their use, given that breakthrough infections among the vaccinated are way less likely to transmit the virus. Evidence through June confirmed that protection is seemingly lower for emerging variants, meaning that the rapidly mutating virus can produce variants that are sufficiently different such that the first round of vaccines could not immunize against them. In September 2021, Fauci objected when Florida's Republican governor Ron DeSantis disingenuously ignored vaccination-reducing transmission. DeSantis did that to undercut government vaccine mandates for obvious political reasons.
At the end of the day, though, it is it's about your health and whether you want that protection or not. It really doesn't impact me or anyone else.
That's false. Please explain to folks listening right now why that's false.
Well, I mean, I didn't hear him very well from the sound, but I mean, if he feels that vaccines are not important for people, that they're just important for some people, that's completely incorrect. Vaccination, Jim, has been the solution to every major public health issue in which a vaccine was developed for. I mean, smallpox, polio, measles. I'm not sure what people are talking about when they push back on vaccinations. It is historically, over decades and decades and decades, shown to be the way you control an infectious disease.
Beyond that, I mean, to clarify, his point at the end there was to say it's just a personal choice about yourself. It doesn't impact anybody else. Explain why that's just not true.
Yeah. Well, that's not true at all. I mean, obviously, it's important for you as an individual for your own personal protection, safety, and health. But when you have a virus that's circulating in the community and you are not vaccinated, you are part of the problem because you're allowing yourself to be a vehicle for the virus to be spreading to someone else. So it isn't as if it stops with you. If that were the case, then it would be only about you. But it doesn't. You can get infected even if you get no symptoms or minimally symptomatic, and then pass it on to someone who in fact might be very vulnerable, an elderly person, a person with an underlying disease.
Should be pretty easy to understand, right? Anyone who whines about, why should I get vaccinated if I'm not at risk, must be pretty clueless, right? A large pool of unvaccinated potential hosts, allowing a virus to mutate and produce new variants of undetermined virulence, should be pretty understandably a bad thing, right? Well, tell that to half the fucking country. Anyway, in October 2021, Fauci discussed using vaccine booster doses to counteract waning protection. This confirmed his December 2020 prediction that boosters would likely be needed. Waning infection-induced immunity also permitted reinfections, so this had nothing to do with vaccines specifically. New variants are new variants, which existing antibodies may not recognize, no matter how they were acquired. In early 2020, experts instead assumed infection-induced immunity confers lifelong protection against reinfection. This assumption simply allowed experts to calculate herd immunity threshold, or HIT. HIT gave an urgently needed risk assessment early in the pandemic when reinfections weren't common enough to strongly bias calculations. Experts updated this no reinfection assumption as new data came in. Reinfections increase HIT, making herd immunity harder to achieve. Fauci recognized that risk. He thus progressively informed the public about factors that make HIT harder to reach, acknowledging uncertainty where it existed. In April 2020, Fauci gave a HIT range of 40% to over 85%, as we mentioned. In June, he said infection-induced immunity could wane in less than a year. He also said we could fall below HIT due to lower vaccination rates and imperfect vaccines, as well as mutation rates characteristic of coronaviruses, something that was already well understood. In December, he said booster vaccinations would likely be needed due to waning immunity. He also predicted herd immunity if 75 to 85% of people were vaccinated. We were still below 70% by May 2023, supporting Fauci's concerns regarding low vaccination rate, and debunking his contrarian critics like Matt Shapiro, Political Math on Twitter, who didn't even check whether we reached 75 to 85% vaccination rates. He just whined about how Fauci promised us herd immunity and we didn't get it. Yeah, no shit, because of vaccine hesitancy that results from anti-vax frauds poisoning the public consciousness. I'm surprised we got close to 70% to begin with, given all the lies that were circulating on a minute-to-minute basis, quite frankly. Hit estimates could increase by late 2020 since reinfections were documented, as were the most transmissible Alpha and Delta variants with their larger R0. Fauci correctly narrowed his hit estimate to higher values by December 2020, but for the wrong reason. He did it in response to public opinion, not just due to reinfections, increased transmissibility, imperfect vaccines, and so forth. Still, he was correct in his warnings regarding factors increasing hit. These factors can lead to recurring infection waves that peak for reasons other than herd immunity. Fauci discussed this in 2022. Yet the GBD falsely claimed that all populations will eventually reach herd immunity. In 2023, Jay repeated this falsehood to mock the neurologist Jonathan Howard. Jay should have known about basic immunology, like that herd immunity can be prevented by processes that introduce people susceptible to infection, such as birth, migration, and waning immunity. How embarrassing for the fucking head of NIH. But that's nowhere near the extent of the humiliation for Jay. The GBD also bungled death projections in ways Fauci warned about. It's a long list, which we'll have to wait for a dedicated Jay Bhattacharya video. For now, we just have to understand that Fauci was more accurate and more honest about literally everything. Moving on to mortality projections and vaccinating the infected. In mid-March 2020, Fauci expressed uncertainty on mortality projections because total deaths depended on how we responded. But he said millions could suffer if we were complacent. By late March, Fauci projected 100,000 to 200,000 USA deaths and said 1 to 2 million was unlikely. But he stressed that the way we respond will determine the outcome.
We have a graph. We have the beginning of a graph. We know this is going to go up. We have the experience of China. We have the experience of Italy.
Yeah.
Can you give us some projections?
It is going to be totally dependent upon how we respond to it. So I can't give you a number. If we now sit back complacently.
I'm not asking to be complacent. I'm asking for a realistic. I mean, that's what the public is looking for.
I can't give you a realistic number until we put into the factor of how we respond. If we are complacent and don't do really aggressive containment and mitigation, the number could go way up and be involved in many, many millions.
How the fuck is this difficult for any adult human with a fully functional brain to understand? If we all go about our business as usual, coughing all over each other at crowded events and whatnot, shit will be way worse than if we all stay home for a while and use masks and don't get close to each other in public. But Fauci was at least clear about his projections to the best of his limited ability so early in the pandemic.
I've never seen a model of the diseases that I've dealt with which the worst case scenario actually came out. They always overshoot. So when you use numbers like 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million, that almost certainly is off the chart. Now, it's not impossible, but very, very unlikely. So it's difficult to present. I mean, looking at what we're seeing now, I would say between 100 and 200,000 cases, but I don't want to be held to that because it's deaths. I mean, we're going to have millions of cases, but I just don't think that we really need to make a projection when it's such a moving target that you can so easily be wrong.
Of course, his prediction, far from catastrophizing, ended up being relatively charitable since over 1 million Americans did die from COVID, largely but not entirely due to failures in early response and anti-vaccine sentiment among the public. Nevertheless, Fauci's words were consistent with a March 2020 report from Neil's team. That report discussed mitigation scenarios with spread slowed using non-pharmaceutical interventions, along with suppression scenarios involving more sharply limited transmission. The report projected 84,000 to 470,000 deaths and 620,000 to 1.5 million deaths across suppression and mitigation scenarios, respectively. And we can see how awful things would have gotten if precisely zero social distancing had taken place. So Fauci had legitimate grounds for saying 1 to 2 million was unlikely with the right interventions. His 100,000 to 200,000 projection was spot on for the first wave, leaving open the question of more waves. In April 2020, Fauci warned of another wave occurring in late 2020 if mitigation didn't happen.
The third and final thing that I think gets back to the question that many of you in the audience have asked of us is about, would this possibly become a seasonal cyclic thing? And I've always indicated to you that I think it very well might. And the reason I say that is that what we're starting to see now in the Southern Hemisphere, in Southern Africa, and in the Southern Hemisphere countries is that we're having cases that are appearing as they go into their winter season. And if, in fact, they have a substantial outbreak, it will be inevitable that we need to be prepared that we'll get a cycle around the second time.
In October 2020, Fauci projected reaching 300,000 to 400,000 dead if mitigation was insufficient. Reported deaths matched Fauci's 300,000 to 400,000 projection, while excess deaths exceeded it. In Bobby Kennedy's shitty book, he said that Fauci used Neil's work to overestimate deaths by a factor of 5. Total bullshit. He was spot on. Bobby also pretended to criticize Fauci by claiming that Neil predicted 2.2 million deaths. Bobby disingenuously cherry-picked Neil's unmitigated scenario for a 2-year period where society had no extra precautions, policy interventions, nor vaccines. Reality had mitigation and vaccines. And guess what? Half of that number came true even with precautions, interventions, and vaccines. Not too hard to imagine, right? So Bobby made a big stink out of good science to accuse good scientists of lying to justify draconian mandates. Fucking ridiculous. Like the fraud that he is, Bobby ignored the more applicable mitigation or suppression scenarios, just like he ignored Fauci's projections. Fauci's projections were more accurate than the GBD Fauci critiqued. The GBD, for instance, said lockdowns would lead to more excess mortality in years to come. That can be checked for Sweden and Florida, since the GBD said they lacked lockdowns. Florida's excess death rates through 2023 was near several states and the USA overall. Sweden's excess death rates weren't lower than most of its Nordic neighbors. Sweden and Florida thus debunk the GBD's mortality prediction and vindicate Fauci's criticism of the GBD. And experts caught Jay distorting excess mortality figures to suit his declaration's conclusion. For example, he said Sweden had only 1,800 total excess deaths, when it was actually 3 times higher. That's confirmed by around 5,600 excess deaths in the WHO's analysis of Sweden. Jay's frequent co-author Aaron even flat out admitted that he and Jay's mortality projections underestimated deaths.
Article with Jay that really got us onto a big adventure of measuring seroprevalence in Santa Clara study. But in that article, we actually put down the number of how many deaths we thought that the epidemic was going to have. It was not a very strong prediction, but nevertheless, we were way off.
Way off indeed, champ, and it wasn't due to incompetence either. It was due to doing politically motivated dogshit science. No matter how you slice it, the GBD's authors were less accurate than Fauci's projections. In 2023, Fauci reflected on why the USA reached 1 million deaths. He proposed plausible explanations such as lower vaccination rates, poor healthcare delivery, and healthcare disparities. Quite charitably, he didn't even overtly mention the disinformation he fought against, like that of the GBD and Trump. Fauci was also insightful about other nations, especially compared to Jay, as we demonstrated when discussing New Zealand. India is another example. Fauci opposed a strategy of infection-induced herd immunity for India. Jay instead said in July 2020 that herd immunity, not Fauci's lockdown, was India's only feasible policy. Jay meant infection-induced herd immunity, since this was long before vaccine-induced immunity was feasible. Jay also gave a 0.1% IFR for India. Jay underestimated IFR by about 4 times by not accounting for the mortality underreporting, Fauci noted. So Jay would underestimate COVID-19 deaths in India by 4 times, meaning by millions of deaths. That's more deaths than Bobby's worm-addled brain pretended that Fauci exaggerated deaths by. In early January 2021, Jay said most of India had natural immunity. Seroprevalence data shared in February showed 21%. Fauci in September 2020 said that's not enough for herd immunity in this clip we already watched, but let's watch it again.
You were not listening to what the director of the CDC said, that in New York it's about 22%. If you believe 22% is herd immunity. I believe you're alone in that.
Easy to grasp, huh? So people should have been on alert for another wave. A March 2021 preprint showed 24% of the population had infection-induced immunity by late December 2020 or early January 2021. The peer-reviewed version of this analysis confirmed the same value of about 24%. Yet Jay irresponsibly didn't correct his estimate of over 50%, published in early January 2021. Then India suffered a huge wave of deaths in April and May 2021, supporting Fauci's warning. Fauci recommended a brief lockdown after Jay exaggerated infection-induced immunity. Here's Fauci addressing India in May 2021.
I think it's clear that you have to take the step of shutting down most of the country, particularly the involved areas. And I don't mean shutting down for 6 months. You don't need to do that long. You just need to break the chain of transmission. One can do that by shutting down to the extent possible for 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And then as soon as the cases start coming down and you vaccinate more people, then you could get ahead of the trajectory of the outbreak. Because obviously you've got to get as many people vaccinated as you possibly can. And when you do that, you've also got to do public health measures.
India's situation warned against dropping restrictions too early, supporting Fauci's advice and undermining Jay's GBD herd immunity-based recommendation. Fauci noted this in a Senate hearing in the same month.
I wanted to ask you today, Dr. Fauci, what can we learn from India's outbreak that we should apply to our response here in the U.S.?
Well, I think one of the important things is don't ever underestimate the situation. You know, the reason that India is in such dire straits now is that they had an original surge and made the incorrect assumption that they were finished with it. And what happened, they opened up prematurely and wind up having a surge right now that we're all very well aware of is extremely devastating. That's the first thing.
But of course, Jay didn't admit his error. He didn't learn anything. Instead, he just stubbornly reaffirmed his predetermined politically based opposition to lockdowns. Fauci drew the lesson that nations like India should have been given more access to vaccines. Yet Jay, in January 2021, used India to say vaccination didn't benefit those with a prior infection. He said that in order to oppose government vaccine mandates for people with prior infections. Weeks earlier, Fauci instead recommended that those previously infected should get vaccinated.
Do you expect that the vaccine will be like a flu vaccine, meaning you'll have to get a new shot every year?
I'm not so sure it'll be every year, but I would be surprised if it gave lifelong immunity the way the measles vaccine does.
This is a question from Jan in Arizona who says, will people who have already had the virus be recommended to get the vaccine as well?
The answer is yes, because once you get infected with the virus, it isn't certain how long that protection would be.
To get into the reasons why some vaccines confer lifelong immunity and others don't is a discussion regarding viral morphology and genetics, mutation rates for specific families of viruses, details regarding vaccinology and immunology, some of which is covered in my playlists regarding microbiology and infectious diseases and immunology. While this goes beyond the scope of this video, the short explanation for this reasoning is that the vaccine would strengthen that person's immune response and shorten the time for it to occur. Subsequent research has confirmed the benefit of vaccinating previously infected people to offer what is called hybrid immunity. You get higher antibody levels and diverse immune responses. Vaccines target the spike protein, while natural infection involves exposure to the whole virus. Hybrid immunity involves the immune system being able to recognize and neutralize multiple strains. So again, like always, Fauci is right and Jay is wrong. Hence, experts' contempt for Jay and respect for Fauci, and the contempt towards Fauci espoused by the state. It is easy to acknowledge that Jay and his cronies have oceans of blood on their hands. Unethical to vaccinate recovered patients, no benefit and some harm, absolutely insane. While the support for Fauci among the scientific community is very easy to understand, and yet Rand just keeps keeps towing the line of the state narrative. He just keeps pretending that Fauci lied about vaccine benefits and uncertainty on infection-induced immunity strength. Disinformers like Rand continue to lie about experts and about science by pretending that these experts are lying when they make recommendations based on rock-solid science. Moving right along, let's get to the harassing, firing, imprisoning, and murdering of experts. Yes, you heard me right. COVID-19 disinformers harassed the shit out of experts. Republican Senator and Zodiac killer Ted Cruz falsely accused Fauci of lying about funding WIV research. Cruz used that accusation to threaten Fauci with prosecution. Fauci said this threat was a dangerous attack on the scientific community since Cruz was essentially trying to intimidate experts by making an example out of Fauci. This was taken up by Elon Musk, the part-time Nazi permanent sad boy oligarch and former Trump-appointed goon who gleefully gutted the entire government for his own financial gain. Elon promoted the debunked lie about gain-of-function research and twisted Fauci's words to claim that Fauci said he couldn't be questioned because he was science. Funny how none of the buttholes who whine about following the science have ever taken a moment to actually look into the science, huh? Elon says science can't be settled. Anyone who says the science is settled is a woke Marxist who shouts racism for no reason. What the fuck even is this pathetic meme? But contrary to this blatant misrepresentation, Fauci was open to being questioned, which is why I was able to show him repeatedly expressing uncertainty at every stage in the pandemic. Fauci also distinguished himself from science by saying he won't be around for long, but science will be. That's consistent with his HIV research, where he aptly said science speaks through published evidence, and that strong evidence settles science. This is why I've been able to show you the science upon which Fauci's recommendations were based all the way through this video. Fauci's point to Cruz was that science's representatives suffer unfair attacks in this political climate. For example, ivermectin trolls noticed clinical researcher Andrew Hill as representing evidence that ivermectin doesn't work against COVID, so they sent him death threats, as I showed in my Pierre Corey video. Cruz likewise treated Fauci as representing inconvenient COVID evidence, so Cruz threatened Fauci with baseless prosecution. Disinformers in the Trump administration have targeted other experts. Michael Caputo accused CDC scientists of sedition. It's sedition now to contradict state-sanctioned pseudoscience, kind of like how it's terrorism to fight back against fascism and domestic terrorism. Trump echoed some ridiculous conspiratorial bullshit about FDA staff foiling his re-election bid. Wrap your head around the fucking sitting president of the United States whining about the deep state, the most powerful person in the world, pretending to be an outsider to political power. How does anyone fall for this shit? Former FDA head and massive dickhead Marty McCary accused Fauci of propaganda for stating facts about vaccines we've already discussed, and of personally profiting from the pandemic, which is actually true of Rand Paul. Same with Republican Congressman Michael Cloud. Rand and Marjorie Taylor Greene said Fauci should be prosecuted. He should go to prison. Scientists who defy state-sanctioned pseudoscience should be in jail, of course. This has ramped up again in recent months. The NIH under J ousted experts linked to Fauci. Researchers were investigated and arrested. Does this sound familiar? Bobby firing every reputable scientist in HHS wasn't enough. Now it's time to put them in jail as well, along with those dirty Antifa terrorists. Whether you're protesting pseudoscience that kills people or fascism that kills people, jail is where you end up. Tulsi Gabbard proudly said there's a path to throw Fauci in there too. This is Trump's perpetual play. Prosecute perceived enemies to bury them in court proceedings and legal fees, even if there's no evidence they committed crimes. That's why Biden gave Fauci a pardon, despite Fauci committing no crimes, to protect him from whatever fucked up shit Trump was going to try and do. Rand pretended to not understand this. For years, Fauci gave testimony addressing deceptive nonsense from Rand and other Republican politicians. So Rand was not honestly seeking information in his recent July congressional hearing. What was he doing? He was trying to get Fauci to give testimony that took place after the January 19th, 2025 cutoff date of Fauci's pardon, and thus could be used as a pretext for prosecution. Look at this little turd nugget pretending to not know why Fauci was pardoned by Biden. The real answer is down here in response. Anyway, given how fucking insane the Trump administration is, Fauci knew that they could use literally fucking anything he said and twist it into grounds for prosecution. Just like how anybody who protests ICE is now being labeled a literal terrorist, and a bunch of them are already rotting away in prison. So Fauci recognized this pathetic tactic, and he exercised his constitutional right to not testify.
Given Senator Paul's obvious obsession with calling for my prosecution, his repeated slanderous comments about me, and recently his publicly releasing my unredacted personal diary aimed at embarrassing and intimidating me, the only conclusion I can reach is that the sole reason he is calling me before this committee is to get me to say something, anything, that could vindicate his repeated public pledges that I end up, in his words, quote, behind bars, unquote. Any reasonable person who has followed his unhinged obsession with me would readily come to the same conclusion. Therefore, although it pains me to do so, because of the respect I have for the legislative branch of government and my decades-long record of cooperating with Congress, under the advice of my attorneys, I will invoke my right under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution to refrain from answering your questions. Thank you.
Yep, he and his lawyers figured, fuck you assholes, if I say anything, like literally fucking anything, you'll wiggle your noses and do a goddamn magic spell and turn it into a reason to throw me in jail. So he said nothing. And Rand the shitstain recommended prosecuting Fauci for exercising that right too. Exercising your constitutional rights is now a crime, according to Rand Paul. What a circus sideshow. Republicans also wanted to fabricate state charges that the pardon wouldn't block. Also, with a spectacle like this, gullible idiots can be provoked to murder Fauci, just like David Rose was at CDC. This is the game that the Trump administration is playing. Fauci, other experts, and their loved ones are made to live in fear to set an example. This is what happens if you defy the state narrative. If you uphold science, if you try to poke a hole in fascism with facts, you will be annihilated. And all the spineless, power-hungry shitheads in politics line up to get a treat from Trump for participating in the mayhem. Tommy Tuberville says bring him to Alabama. I'll toss him in jail for you. MTG accused Fauci of being a fucking puppy torturer by falsely tying him to research he didn't fund. She's pretending that Fauci is a monster who tortures puppies. Tell me that isn't manipulative as all hell. Frauds like Rand, no matter how many times they are exposed and humiliated, continue to uphold this complete fever dream of a baseless narrative that Fauci killed millions of people with SARS coronavirus 2, a virus of natural origin that emanated from the Huanan food market. They don't even bother acknowledging their own hypocrisy by marveling at the death toll of a pandemic that they downplayed from day one, doing everything they could to undermine attempts at minimizing deaths, while Fauci warned them every step of the way. Fauci started a thing that killed 15 million people. They blame him for deaths he did everything in his power to prevent. It's like tobacco executives blaming doctors for cancer deaths. What does this kind of bullshit lead to?
What happens when he gets out and accuses me of things that are completely untrue is that all of a sudden that kindles the crazies out there, and I have threats upon my life, harassment of my family and my children with obscene phone calls because people are lying about me. Now, I guess you could say, well, that's the way it goes. I can take the hit.
Look at this worthless piece of shit squirm. This is the face of a fucking fraud who belongs in prison, not the other way around. And what is the motive for the dog pile? What do these worthless frauds stand to gain?
And the police asked him where he was going, and he was going to Washington, D.C. to kill Dr. Fauci. And they found in his car an AR-15 and multiple magazines of ammunition because he thinks that maybe I'm killing people. So I ask myself, Why would Senator want to do this? So go to Rand Paul website and you see Fire Dr. Fauci with a little box that says contribute here. You can do $5, $10, $20, $100. So you are making a catastrophic epidemic for your political gain. So the
You
only
have
thing
politically
the only thing
attacked
that I
your
can-
colleagues and in a politically reprehensible
The
way
only thing that I
attacked their
could think of-
reputations.
Okay,
you won't defend it.
No,
you won't
well-
argue it.
Shut the fuck up, Rand. You jumped on the fuck Fauci bandwagon for political points and money. You are the scum of the earth. You are what you pretend Fauci is. This was in 2022. Do you think anything has changed since then? Fuck no. He still brags about dragging Fauci before Congress again this year. He hid behind a pardon. Now we've got him. Watch me continue torturing an old man for no reason. Vinay stoked further distrust of experts by comparing public health interventions to Nazism in a stunt so mind-numbingly stupid that the Auschwitz Museum had to chime in to tell him to fuck off. And of course, this kind of bullshit activates bottom feeders like Brett Weinstein. Nuremberg Code. Vinay said Nazi thing, so I get to say Nazi thing too. Scientists are evil. Please watch my podcast where I pretend to be a scientist. Steve Kirsch chimed in as well. Some jerk says Nazi something or other too, and I agree. I'm Steve, and I'm blind in one eye because of Peter McCullough. We need to murder scientists, obviously. Bald boy Toby Rogers agrees. Hang the scientists who tried to prevent deaths because Nuremberg. Love me, Daddy RFK. Steve Bannon said that Fauci should be beheaded and his head should adorn the White House lawn. Republican John Bennett said put him in front of a firing squad. State Senator Anthony Bouchard was kind enough to give Fauci a choice between the electric chair, hanging, and lethal injection. What a nice guy. Fauci's death was even promoted by the fucking U.S. Army under the Trump administration. And then remember the guillotine bullshit from earlier? Jeffrey Tucker's right-wing think tank, the Brownstone Institute, is a home for those stoking violence. So its contributing authors include Jeffrey, Martin, Jay, Paul, Toby, Brett, Steve, and Vinay, a real who's who of worthless pieces of shit in the government and on the internet. This contributed to death threats against Fauci and other experts, as well as Fauci's family, including his wife, the nurse and bioethicist Christine Grady. Fauci said that right to the face of some of the Republican politicians who drove those threats, with his wife seated to his left.
So, Dr. Fauci, can you please share with us the nature of the threats you have received since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, there have been everything from harassments by emails, texts, letters of myself, my wife, my 3 daughters. There have been credible death threats leading to the arrests of 2 individuals, and credible death threats means someone who clearly was on their way to kill me. And it's required my having protective services essentially all the time. It is very troublesome to me. It is much more troublesome because they've involved my wife and my 3 daughters.
At these moments, how do you feel? Keep your mic on.
Terrible.
Do you continue to receive threats today?
Yes, I do. Every time someone gets up and says I'm responsible for the death of people throughout the world, the death threats go up.
Look at this poor man. For the crime of promoting sound science to save lives in a global pandemic, he is rewarded with never-ending harassment and worrying about being murdered every single day. To make things worse, Trump revoked Fauci's security protection, as if to say, can someone kill this prick already? And of course, if Fauci were to get murdered, the pieces of shit who made it happen will line up to falsely claim plausible deniability. Fauci and his loved ones may never feel safe again, just like Trump and his cronies wanted. Because that's the message. Speak up for truth, and this is what happens to you. And the propaganda never ends. Because of the fast-paced news cycle, there is always the risk of people not getting fully indoctrinated, so Jay and Marty worked with a geneticist, Bryce Nichols, to target Fauci in the insane documentary, Thank You, Dr. Fauci. It promotes total horseshit regarding SARS coronavirus 2 lab leak, HIV vaccine leak, and more. Bryce was interviewed for the documentary, as was molecular biologist Richard Ebright. Bryce inflamed the public by using using lab leak claims to insinuate that scientists were murderers. Richard extended Bryce's murder rhetoric to Fauci, calling him a sociopathic accessory to murder who must pay. Richard then championed Republican efforts to harass experts like Fauci. Accessories to murder, they must pay. Criminal associates. What a fucking dong. He also targeted Fauci's wife as if the threats against her weren't already enough. She's a sociopath because reasons. Elon joined that dumbfuck groupthink, pretending her job was ensuring Fauci behaved ethically, which would be a conflict of interest. Elon's own Twitter reporting system debunked his deception, citing how bioethics research is not the fucking HR department of NIH. Bobby the buffoon chimed in to show everyone how fucking dumb he is as well. Everything is a racket and a cartel, but not me sucking on the teat of the oligarchy in deregulating all the harmful substances I built my platform on pretending to want to get rid of, and all the shilling for the alt health industry. That's not a racket at all. Of course, in reality, Grady didn't even work in Fauci's institute. Elon is so fucking dumb that he's basically suggesting that a Harvard English professor's job would be to check the grammar of the math department. Even CNN Business made fun of him for that one. Lockdowns harmed Elon's businesses and he's getting revenge, nothing more. This is why this cum stain bought Twitter, so he could spread shit like this. Just one more lockdown, my king. He can amplify narratives like this as much as he wants. He bought the platform to manipulate public perception of reality. That's all. Did we not get enough familiar loser fraud faces in yet? Eric Weinstein jumped on Daddy Elon's lie too. How do I not know about the thing that is debunked right under this dumb tweet? Great contribution, Eric. Don't you have some physics to pretend to be doing? Other women were also targeted. For example, a lab leak troll sexually harassed virologist Angela Rasmussen because she debunked lab leak claims. Lab leak charlatans like Alina Chan even promoted that very troll despite knowing about the harassment. And when called out for it, she acts like a fucking child. Alina relied on misogynists, such as the lab leak crackpot Gilles Desmanouf, if they said what she wanted to hear against experts like Fauci. Look at this dickbag talking about OnlyFans because she's not wearing a fucking lab coat in a casual social media post. Here's Alina promoting this douche nozzle. It's just a cesspool all the way down, from the president to his underlings, to political up-and-comers, to the podcast bros, to their social media amplifiers, and every other loser trying to make a name for themselves by jumping on the groupthink smear train. And this brings us to the ultimate ramification of all this activity, the obliteration of public trust in legitimate experts. When social media is completely overrun with disinforming content, amplifying these bogus narratives, and almost zero content debunking it, since there's only like a dozen or so people like myself who have the time and the luxury and the spine to do it, the public becomes hopelessly brainwashed. This is to be expected. When you hear a lie 100 times, it becomes the truth, especially when the truth is drowned out by the lies or deliberately silenced. Worthless oligarch gremlins like Peter Thiel join in and lie about Fauci to sow public distrust in experts and in government interventions. These interventions interfered with Thiel's business interests and went against his right-wing political ideology. So they're in the crosshairs. He does this with climate science as well.
It was wrong on so many things. Again, the COVID thing was like this watershed moment. And if they were so wrong about COVID, so wrong about it was the food market or the Wuhan lab. And you couldn't ask questions, and they didn't just block things that were wrong. They blocked a lot of things that were, I think, correct.
Yeah.
And then, why shouldn't we also rethink the climate science narrative and, all these other things?
Do you see climate as the big next one that people are going to really start challenging more outwardly? Because that seems like the major one that we still aren't quite addressing, although there's a few more people online
I think
willing
to. I think there are a lot of versions. The big meta narrative on science, the big meta narrative, I would say, is people claim that there's a lot of science going on and that science is very healthy. And my skeptical view of science in general is I think most of these people are not scientists. They're not doing much work. They're not making any interesting new discoveries. They're just politicians getting money from the government.
Jesus Christ, it's like all of the frauds lumped into one. You weren't allowed to question lab leak, even though you totally fucking were, and the scientists were examining both possibilities thoroughly until further virology research showed lab leak to be totally unsupported. Climate change is the big one, of course, says Dave Rubin, the pointless ass clown. And Peter agrees, because he should get to pollute as much as he wants. So fuck off, Marxist EPA. You're a bunch of pseudoscientific Antifa terrorists. And also, science isn't healthy to do. It's a big pile of dumb. Scientists are not scientists, and they don't do any science. They're just sitting around collecting that sweet, sweet grant money from the government and picking their butts. Sabina Hassenfelder much? He funds her. I'm sorry. The agenda is so painfully transparent that it's hard to imagine he even thinks this could work on anyone. Peter Thiel, the accessory to genocide with his $31 billion, is accusing hard-working, underpaid scientists of opportunism and greed, right as their funding is being pulled out from under them. Astounding. Tech oligarchs Mark Andreessen and Patrick Collison also stoked distrust of experts like Fauci. They encouraged much of the public's desire to punish experts for government restrictions, such as by rejecting science, experts explain. Look at this venture capitalist ding-dong Mark Andreessen asking ChatGPT if Fauci ever lied. It says no since he didn't, and the dumb fuck tweets it anyway, making fun of ChatGPT as if it were programmed to say that. Whereas if it had said yes, he lies, he would have posted that, glazing AI as the all-seeing, all-knowing eye of Sauron. These people are so fucking stupid that it makes you wonder how they ever achieved anything in life. And here's Patrick Collison, CEO of Stripe, rattling off a bunch of bullshit about flip-flopping, motivated reasoning, denial of this, changing of that, crazy something or other, when you know this idiot wasn't following a single stitch of this stuff. He's just regurgitating some crap he heard from Elon or some other rich asshole. There's always a parallel with climate science, since that's the other area that threatens the oligarchy's profit margin. They did this to Michael Mann, who I interviewed for my Lee Zeldin video. In the 2000s and 2010s, he was maligned for his science that challenged the fossil fuel industry. It's no different with public health, which is why Mann and Hotez wrote a book together. Vaccines and Autism in the 90s, Public Health Experts and Smoking in the 80s. It's a fucking cliche at this point.
We got a government now. It passes all kinds of laws, so you can't smoke here, you can't smoke there, you can't smoke anywhere, all right? But that government collects $28 billion a year in taxes from smokers, all right? Show me that those people came down from lung cancer from smoking. From all of the people, from all the doctors, Professor, you damn right I doubt it. You doubt that smoking causes lung cancer? Read my lips, pal. You I doubt it, all right? Of the number of lung, difficult to believe that anybody could be so stupid today. But of the number of lung cancer cases, reported in this country, 60% of those lung cancer cases are from smokers. All right? No, 90%. 60%. Where are you getting your figures from? Who says it's from smoking? Where are you getting your figures from? I got the two non-smokers saying 85 and 90. All right. Between 85 and 90%. Nicotine addiction, a report of the Surgeon General. Let me see this fat slob, will you? Bring him up here.
This schmuck is Morton Downey Jr. He was a trash TV talk show host and Joe Rogan's predecessor in spreading medical disinformation for money. See how fucking dumb he sounds to us today? Whining about the fake science connecting smoking and lung cancer risk, and how the meatheads in the audience cheer him on as he bravely exposes the corruption from those phony nerds in their lab coats. This is exactly what idiots sound like today when they parrot whatever bullshit they heard about COVID vaccines causing whatever the fuck, or ivermectin curing whatever the shit, but it's suppressed by big bad pharma, which actually makes it in the first place, or people who have been captured by lab leak propaganda. It's a stubborn, confident, indoctrinated wrongness that kills people. Morton later admitted he was wrong, but guess what? He died of lung cancer anyway. Similarly, individuals who received the illustrious Herman Cain Award learned how right Fauci was while dying of COVID-19. Government restrictions on smoking, vaccine exemptions, and energy, which were based entirely on sound science and with the benefit of the citizenry in mind, is ironically what motivated public distrust of experts in public health, vaccines, and climate, respectively. This is because the tobacco, alt health, and fossil fuel industries inflamed that distrust with waves of propaganda meant to undermine the science that threatens their profits. 1980s tobacco shills used disinformation manipulation tactics, and subsequent science deniers copied those tactics, like baselessly disputing evidence-based scientific consensus or pretending that experts are politicizing science so that governments can control people, when it is really the oligarchy that controls the government to bend to its interests rather than those of the citizenry. These tobacco tactics specifically contributed to the right's diminishing trust in science in the USA since the 1980s, turning instead to faulty intuition, religion, conspiracy theories, or blindly accepting political narratives. By 2014, right-leaning distrust had manifested on vaccines, climate, nuclear power, evolution, GMOs, and so on. It's why before Trump's 2015 campaign, those on the right were more likely to diverge from evidence-based expert assessments on topics like climate and vaccines. Experts on these topics weren't to blame for public distrust any more than Fauci and other experts are on COVID. Kind of shocking seeing the numbers regarding vaccines this high pre-pandemic, no? How I wish we could just get back to here. But COVID-19 disinformers pretend otherwise, following tobacco shills in claiming that distrust is due to public health experts politicizing science. Here's Matt Ridley with some adorable theater about nobody being able to investigate and no lockdowns and blah blah dogma. Stupid scientists are to blame, not frauds like me who brainwash people with lies about science. This is a crucial point. When the public distrusts experts on science and denies the results of the scientific process, it is because they've been brainwashed by political ideology. You can't buy off the entire global scientific community, so any attempt to paint the consensus of the global scientific community as some kind of conspiracy is the easiest way to spot a science-denying fraud. You can buy off one scientist and you can fund one fake study. That's what the fossil fuel and alt health industries do to make their lies seem like real science. But you can't buy and fund them all. But people will be ensnared by the alluring narrative and buy into the crackpots who tell them what they want to hear about the big bad whatever doing the naughty money thing. A tale as old as time. Distrust towards the science surrounding the COVID pandemic and related topics is driven by contrarians spreading disinformation to hide the fact that experts were almost always right on the science. They just need someone to blame for restrictions they didn't like in order to stir up fervor among the public. It's also a right-wing excuse to cut government funding for public health and virology research. Just more slash-and-burn Doge-style trickery. Hence the right's greater acceptance of lab leak claims and greater distrust of public health experts in general. Right-wing climate change deniers applied these garbage tactics to become lab leak proponents, as noted by the astronomer Ken Rice. They distort the history of what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic so they can pretend they were right and experts were wrong. And that brings us to the final chapter, distorting COVID-19 history. To stop Fauci critics from abusing 2020 hindsight, check what they said before and during the pandemic. If they said nothing, they weren't informing people like Fauci did. If they said something, it's always the case that they got less things right than Fauci did, or they were actively spreading disinformation he debunked. They have to distort COVID-19 history to hide that. It's the only way. They're reverse fortune tellers, since what happens is reliably the opposite of what they say, as Jonathan noted. For example, Judith Curry engaged in gullible groupthink by copying Jay's lies in her shitty book, and yet she accused experts like Fauci of groupthink. That's because experts rejected her fellow right-wing climate change denier Nick Lewis's claim of herd immunity after one wave. Judith was sure Nick knew better than Fauci. He did not. Matt joined their groupthink to accept praise from Judith for his disgusting climate change denial. So did Martin, whining about herd immunity, only for Nick to later admit they were wrong, that herd immunity had not been reached. Another example of reverse fortune tellers are the main lab leak group called Drastic, with its close collaborators Alina Chan, Matt Ridley, and Steve Massey. They hoped Rand's July hearing would make people continue to distrust experts like Fauci, but Drastic members spewed utter nonsense that Fauci has refuted, like that a vaccine leak caused the AIDS pandemic, herd immunity occurred after one wave, focused protection worked to achieve herd immunity, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin worked to treat COVID-19, vaccines didn't prevent transmission, and they were actually weapons of mass destruction, all the greatest hits. But Fauci critic, opponent of virology funding, and worthless climate change denying coal baron Matt Ridley is the end boss of reverse fortune telling. It's a never-ending parade of false claims, gain-of-function research that never existed, saying in 2012 that pandemics were growing less likely when they were growing more likely. pretending that masks don't work, pretending the COVID-19 case fatality rate was 0.1 to 0.3%, claiming that Stockholm achieved herd immunity after the first wave, saying that a large second wave would happen in neither Sweden or in London as well, pretending that COVID-19 was mild in India, pretending that focus protection worked, even pretending that vaccines don't prevent infections. Matt had the courage to admit that he was badly wrong about a lot, and puzzled by how wrong he was. Then he just turned right around and pretended that Lab Leak explained it all, since that's one of his two big grifts. But what really explains it is that Matt spent decades defending his ideological narratives by lying to the public about topics like climate science, nutrition science, and virology. Fauci, rather, spent those decades studying infectious diseases and immunology. This means Fauci was prepared to inform the public when pandemics happened. Meanwhile, Matt tried to normalize disinformation about the pandemic and experts, as did Judith, Drastic, Jay, Rand, and others. That undermined democracy, as Fauci noted.
Push back on the misinformation and disinformation. Do not accept the normalization of untruths as something that's normal. Because when people get discouraged and throw up their hands and say, well, what are you going to do? You know, social media, they just spout out these things that are absolutely untrue, from things as ridiculous that COVID vaccines have killed more people than COVID. I mean, the data doesn't mean anything. And when people say that and it gets amplified on social media, the people who are not like us, who do it for a living, they see that. And when you normalize untruths, then no one knows what true is really true. And guess what? When you look at history, when that happens, that's when democracies fall apart, when there's no truth there. So anybody can say anything. So what's the solution to that? The solution is that we, certainly, you know, me at my age, but more importantly, the audience at most of your age, you can't give up and you can't get discouraged.
It's quite trying at times, yet we persevere. He's right. We can combat this by flooding the internet with accurate information, and in my case, aggressively debunking the frauds who peddle disinformation so that the public is armed against subsequent waves of ideologically motivated disinformation. Otherwise, this disinformation pattern will succeed during future pandemics, environmental disasters, public health emergencies, and so on. Trump's staff tried to silence pushback against misinformation. Vinay, for instance, got YouTube to close Jonathan's channel where Jonathan exposed Vinay's misinformation. This is ironic given how Trump's staff is always pretending they were being censored or persecuted. It's the easiest narrative for picking up points from anti-woke idiots. These are the Joe Roganites, the free speech warriors, who inevitably silence those who expose their lies as soon as they get a bit of power. And when Trump's minions can't silence their critics, they troll them without addressing their points. Vinay did that to Jonathan after Jonathan debunked COVID-19 misinformation. Wow, it's so bad. He just wants to make money. Nothing but narrative. This is all they have, because they sure as fuck don't have any science. Speaking of Jonathan Howard, he will be an ideal person to chat with before we wrap this up. His book is called We Want Them Infected: How the Failed Quest for Herd Immunity Led Doctors to Embrace the Anti-Vaccine Movement and blinded Americans to the threat of COVID. It's about much of what we've discussed in this video, and the doctors who emerged to align themselves with anti-science narratives for financial and political gain. He is quite familiar with the crusade against Fauci, so let's see if we can get some more insight. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us. So I've just given my viewers quite the rundown here regarding the history of harassment and character assassination towards Fauci, but I wanted to give you a chance to kind of summarize maybe your perception of what's been going on with Republicans and Fauci since the start of the pandemic.
Wow, that's a big question and a sort of a big topic.
Yeah.
You know, he has obviously become a scapegoat. One thing that we've seen regarding the pandemic is that the people who tried to contain it and whose job it was to contain it were blamed for the whole thing. They were blamed for the origins of COVID. They were blamed for all of the mitigation measures that were required to contain the virus, and they were blamed for the death toll. The virus itself was wiped away from the equation in order to blame people, not the virus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of the most shocking thing to me is not only all of this propaganda about origins, but citing the death toll, whether it's 15 million or 30 million or whatever it is, and trying to blame that. Well, they were the ones shouting, hey, this is what we need to do, lockdowns, vaccines, etc. Well, they were downplaying everything on their end. That it's just it's the ultimate irony to me. I don't know.
Right. And the exact same people who claim that the virus leaked from a lab also are the people who resisted all of these mitigation measures against it. And beyond that, wanted to mass infect people, right? So there was this proposal in 2020, which has now been forgotten, deliberately forgotten, to mass infect everyone under the age of 60 or even 70 with COVID, in the claims that this would end the pandemic in 3 to 6 months. So, these people don't want anyone to remember this. They don't want anyone to remember that they predicted COVID would kill 10,000 or 20,000 or 40,000 Americans, and that the best way to get rid of the virus was to spread the virus.
That's not even flu numbers. It's insane. So, I mean, okay, let's talk about this because you wrote a book and you used that chilling line. Of course, we want them infected as the title of the book. So in this video, my viewers have seen me talk at this point about infection-induced immunity, but you wrote a whole book on this. Why were they so obsessed with it? What can we expand on this?
Well, so I think that a decent number of people, and we can begin to name names at this point because these are famous people, such as Dr. Scott Atlas, who was Trump's coronavirus czar in 2020, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who is now head of the NIH and kind of running the CDC as well. People like that thought that COVID was vastly overestimated at the start of the pandemic. These were the people who were saying that it was going to kill 10,000 or 20,000 Americans. And they claimed that parts of the world and parts of the country had herd immunity as early as the summer of 2020. Mm-hmm. And they claimed that immunity to COVID was going to be lifelong or long lasting, and that we could protect older people by infecting people like ourselves, even though none of us were vaccinated at the time. And none of these people worked on COVID units, and that shows. I did. I don't think I saved a lot of lives, but I saw a lot of stuff. And so you can listen to all of their statements regarding the pandemic and think to yourself correctly, no one who worked on a COVID unit would say anything like this. And they were very explicit at the time, 6 years ago, that they wanted people infected. The title of the book comes from a quote by someone who's not nearly as famous, Dr. Paul Alexander, who was an epidemiologist in the first Trump administration, who said that we want them infected. Mm-hmm. This is how we get herd immunity. And in 2020, they objected to mitigation measures, not because they thought that they failed to slow the virus, but precisely because they knew that's what they did. They viewed every uninfected young person as a policy failure, and they worked to disrupt all measures to contain it: masks, testing, ventilation, vaccines, you name it, because they wanted them infected. These days, they will say, we just wanted poor children in schools. We just wanted businesses to be open. So there's a massive and successful revisionist history regarding the pandemic.
Complete revision. I mean, so yeah, you brought up Jay Bhattacharya. So I wanted to talk, because I'm still trying to wrap my head around this completely. I think that perhaps naively I understand, but the Great Barrington Declaration, Jay and his co-authors, all of this anti-lockdown sentiment, downplaying infection risk, downplaying vaccine efficacy. Who does this narrative serve? Is it really as simple as screw people, let the economy go, doesn't matter how many people die? Or am I being simplistic with it? Or what? Who does this narrative serve, and exactly how?
Yeah, so, I'll just correct you on one thing. Mm-hmm. They didn't downplay vaccine efficacy, at least at the start of 2021. They claimed that vaccines were perfect, that they wiped away severe disease, and that they blocked transmission, anything to get people to be unafraid of the virus. So first of all, you mentioned the Great Barrington Declaration, which was written in October 2020, right before vaccines came out, but also right before the deadliest wave of the pandemic came out, when 3,000 Americans would die per day. So this is when they unleashed their policy of mass infection. And I urge people to actually read it. It's about 800 words. It's very short. It's all about herd immunity via natural immunity. And if you go to the frequently asked questions section, they claimed that it would end the pandemic in 3 to 6 months. I mean, they will now deny this, which is why I encourage everyone to go actually read it. And what are the origins of the Great Barrington Declaration? So it was so named because it was signed and it was written in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, at the home of I always forget the name exactly, but the American Economic Enterprise Research Institute, some sort of right-wing libertarian think tank, which was headed at the time, and this was created by a man by the name of Jeffrey Tucker, who is now a major Maha power broker, and he sounds like a cartoon supervillain, but he is an overt child labor advocate and pro-tobacco advocate. And I think that a lot of these people, were very worried about businesses and the economy. Matter of fact, Jay Bhattacharya, who was a health economist in April 2020, was very explicit about this, that he was worried that lockdowns and mitigation measures would harm the economy. And I will have to add, I do understand, I don't want to minimize, what small business owners were going through at that time. There were a lot of legitimate fears. But that, I think, was their motivation at the time.
Sure. Yeah, and it's like, look, my heart goes out to anyone who lost a small business during that time, obviously, and you're always playing this game of weighing, economics against lives. But this obsession, I mean, where does discouraging masking and discouraging social distancing, what does that have to do with the economy? You know what I mean? Like, where does that fit in?
Well, I mean, they felt that for everyone under the age of 70 or 60, it kind of
just
varied.
Get infected, yeah.
Right, and they felt that it would be a mild cold for the vast majority of people, that it was kind of the sniffles that we didn't, and the infection mortality rate, it was our fatality rate, was infinitely less for people like ourselves than it was for 80-year-olds, and there's obviously some truth to that.
Right.
But in 2021, COVID became the #1 leading disease killer for young adults. And of course, death is not COVID's only bad outcome, even though it was the only one that they recognized. And this is what did happen. And just imagine what would have happened had 230 million or so unvaccinated Americans contracted COVID simultaneously in the fall of 2020, as they proposed. And they also claim that you could create this impenetrable bubble around, vulnerable people. They dichotomize people. You were vulnerable or you were not. And they claim that you could create this impenetrable bubble around them. And that wasn't the case. Infections in younger people invariably spilled over into older people, which is obviously predictable.
And I kind of want to, after this video, and I've talked about this a bit, I want to incriminate them more than just, they made an erroneous call here, right? What are the ways that they very specifically and dishonestly referenced New Zealand, Sweden, India? Like, what were the points that they tried to put forward that very deceptively twisted data in other places of the world to try to say, hey, no, we're right, this is going to work,
Yeah, so, I mean, they made extraordinarily false claims. Probably the most obvious one is they said absurd things like the flu killed more children than COVID. And they said this in October 2020 at a point when COVID had killed about 110 children and the flu had killed 10. And most of those were sort of left over from the previous flu season. In 2021, 1,000 children or so died from COVID. A single child died from the flu, but to hear Jay Bhattacharya speak, the flu was more dangerous for children. So they just botched, basic statistics like that all the time. They claim that herd immunity had arrived 5 years ago in the summer and spring of 2021. They mocked variants, calling Delta variant, saying there was nothing to worry about. Our former head of the FDA called Omicron variant nature's vaccine and Omacold. I'm speaking about Dr. Marty Makary, even though that variant sent a record number of children to the hospital and to the morgue. And you bring up, Sweden, for example, which had, especially in the start of the pandemic in 2020, had a vastly higher mortality rate than its Nordic neighbors. And they eventually had to introduce drastic mitigation measures to contain the virus in the fall of 2020. But again, there's a lot of revisionist history around that. And even though elementary schools didn't close as a nation in Sweden, they closed individually due to overwhelming COVID outbreaks, as happened here in the United States, including in red states, including in Florida, where the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration helped run the show. But what actually happened doesn't matter in their world, because they called for schools to be open, they proposed schools to be open,
Right.
and they gained power based on these entirely hypothetical, imagined accomplishments. And we can see how they're doing today, controlling measles, controlling explosive diarrhea.
Right.
You know, so history has given us this fascinating natural experiment where people who got famous based on their hypothetical COVID, accomplishments are now flailing given real world power and locking people down to contain Ebola and hantavirus.
Of course, yeah. No, the complete gutting of regulatory bodies is a whole other rabbit hole. But you did mention measles, and so I wanted to talk about Bobby Kennedy a bit. I talk about Bobby Kennedy quite a lot, obviously, and he wrote an entire book on Fauci, which I haven't even looked at. I can't imagine what's in there apart from a couple quotes that I use for this video, but there seems to be, and I'd like for you to talk about this a little bit, a connection between lab leak propaganda or maybe more generally pandemic revisionism and the Maha agenda. So what does that look like?
Yeah, without COVID, it's we'll never know for sure, but it's extremely unlikely, that Maha would have taken power. And we are seeing this now is that these guys are desperate to relitigate the pandemic because pandemic revisionism is being used as a pretext for current vandalism. The CDC and the FDA failed and they let us down. They weren't perfect. Legitimate criticisms are, of course, important. But they are using that to do what they have done, which is to fire people, to purge people, to censor scientists, to cut scientific funding, to inject politics into science. And if you hear their rationalizations for this, they will use COVID mitigations as the reason why that toddlers wore masks justifies the mass purges and firing and censorship of science today.
It's insane. Yeah. I mean, I think that obviously RFK has quite a broad platform where he's always talking about like PFAS and other things, which ironically he ended up deregulating instead of more tightly regulating, nutrition, all of, sugar and this and that and all his nutrition stuff. But yeah, it is pretty undeniable that the pandemic is the centerpiece of all of that. And it makes sense because you can polarize people on this event that we all went through together. And, people lost jobs, but people also lost loved ones. And so it's hard for me to wrap my head around people that went through this and people died and, all of this chaos and still come out blaming scientists. It's just a testament to how pernicious this type of propaganda is, that it's able to capture this many minds.
No, absolutely. I mean, 6 years ago, I was thinking this is going to be the end of the anti-vaccine movement.
Right.
And I obviously couldn't have been more wrong. It supercharged that, even though by some estimates, 200 to 300,000 American lives were lost because people refused vaccines. In the summer of 2021, 5 years ago, being a conservative radio talk show host, was the most deadly profession in America. And I don't understand the lack of outrage about this, to be totally honest with you, from families. I mean, maybe there's some sort of shame there, for example, but the people who misled Americans about vaccines are now seen, and every other mitigation measure are now sort of seen as the saviors, as the people who got it right. And this is because there's something called the COVID Amnesia Project, which is what what we've been talking about, is there has been a very successful movement to rewrite the history of the pandemic and claim that the only problems with COVID were that it leaked from a lab and that we made any effort to contain it at all. Yeah. And I'm beginning to understand how Holocaust denial happened, or why the 1918 flu seemed to leave virtually no footprint in our cultural memory.
Right. Yeah, it's a testament to these people pushing these narratives, being put in positions of power, and then the propaganda disseminated, and then honestly the social media landscape, of course, and Joe Rogan and copycat podcasters just pushing this narrative relentlessly. leaked from a lab, blah, 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 all this stuff. Just it's alarming. The majority of people, this is not a fringe thing. Most people believe all of this stuff. It's really quite astounding to me. But yeah, I don't know. Any further thoughts about how it's disseminated?
Yeah, I mean, they were aided by Fox News and the Wall Street Journal and the heterodox libertarian media, Reason Magazine, Barry Weiss's The Free Press. And I think my own profession bears a lot of the blame. I think a lot of doctors or scientists just kind of look the other way and refuse to call out bad faith actors in our field. I mean, these people come from top universities, Stanford, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, UCSF. For example.
Yeah.
And there was very little pushback. And these guys were also very good at weaponizing their supposed victimization. The fact that YouTube removed a single video of theirs in 2021 was portrayed as this massive censorship campaign. So anytime you tried to criticize them, they would say, I'm being censored, I'm being silenced.
Which is the ultimate card for, all the Roganites and everything. No, free speech, whatever. It's freaking ridiculous. I think that is one of the lack of pushback from academia. Why are these people not expunged from these institutions? That's a whole other question that I can barely wrap my head around. But so I guess in terms of what is happening to Fauci right now, do you have any projections? I mean, like, it's a circus sideshow, obviously, for it's political theater. Is there any possibility that he can be jailed somehow? I mean, they're putting people in jail for terrorism, for protesting. So are they going to succeed in putting an 85-year-old public servant in jail? Where does this lead? Where are we going with this?
Well, I just got done saying I'm pretty bad at predicting the future, so I don't really know. I'd like to think that some of our courts have held up a little bit. Certainly propagandists like Rand Paul, who I think is going to go down in history as, Joseph McCarthy type.
Yes.
At least I hope he does. Have it out for Fauci, that's for sure. And they may end up trying to put him in jail. A lot of people do. The poor man has to watch his back anytime he leaves the house. I mean, his daughters receive death threats as early as March or April 2020. So people have had it out for him for a while. Regardless of what happens to Fauci as an individual, there's this massive climate of fear in science today. People are afraid to speak out, especially if they receive NIH funding. There were some not protesters, but some doctors or scientists who spoke out at the American Diabetes Association recently, and they were escorted off the campus. One of Fauci's right-hand men, a scientist by the name of David Morenz, was arrested for inappropriately, allegedly using Gmail accounts during his time at the NIH, and he was strip searched and put in handcuffs and driven 60 miles away from where he lives to be arraigned and booked. And he is also an 85-year-old, or maybe not quite that old, but senior retired scientist. So who would want to go into public service during the next pandemic? Who would want to be in charge of this when you're going to be blamed for what the virus does, no matter what you do?
Yeah, you're signing up to be the scapegoat of the next political campaign. It really is dark. It's a dark time. I mean, those are all the questions I had. Do you have any last words for the viewer? Just what we can, how to react to this and what we can do?
Just never give up. Just keep fighting for the truth. Keep trying to preserve, what actually happened in 2020 and 2021, and keep speaking out against disinformation and misinformation. It is not beneath you to do so.
Right. Well, amen to that. That's what I'm doing, and you do the same. So thanks so much for joining me.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jonathan. In conclusion, the demonization of Anthony Fauci that has been occurring since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic is nothing short of completely insane. He has never done anything but go strictly by the science and make the most sensible recommendations at his disposal. As we have demonstrated in this video, he was spot on about everything. Origins, infections, lockdowns, immunity, vaccines, everything. All the while, asshats like Jay Bhattacharya distorted science, lied through their teeth, and promoted protocols that got people killed. All for a seat at the big kid table, a ticket into the club of oligarchy ball lickers for a personal payday. In this land of opposites, anyone who speaks truth and saves lives is a villain who killed people, and anyone who spreads lies for political gain that kill people is a true patriot fighting against the deep state. This very neatly describes the alternate reality of the entire Republican Party at this time. They laser focus on someone they need to assassinate because that person represents an impediment to complete and total acceptance of their lies. They concoct a narrative and push it relentlessly until all the lemmings repeat it like a mantra. Fauci bad, Fauci bad, Fauci bad. This is not unique in the slightest. There are countless examples of this outside of the political sphere where such cults operate this way. The pseudo-archaeology cult is the same. Just the same way that Fauci called out Jay and the GBD, Flint demolished Graham Hancock on Joe Rogan, so the alternate reality was concocted where Flint is a liar out of sheer necessity, and they just repeat it over and over and over again until the lemmings repeat it without question. None of them can tell you what Flint lied about, and if you ask them to give you examples, they just shit their pants. But they know he's a liar, just like people know that Fauci is an evil man who killed people. This is the playbook for the fascist regime. Malign, character assassinate, and train the army of lemmings to attack the enemy until that person just removes themselves from public view purely due to fatigue, or until they're thrown in prison. This blind hatred is in stark contrast with the blind adoration of a figure like Bobby Kennedy, who is everything these assholes pretend that Fauci is. Bobby is a monster who gets children killed. And yet, where is the Inquisition there? Well, there was a little of that very recently when Dana Bash dunked on Bobby for CNN. Let's watch some of that as the cherry on top.
You have been placing nearly all the blame on the COVID pandemic and the way that the U.S. responded to it squarely with Dr. Fauci. But of course, he worked for President Trump. Does President Trump also deserve some of the blame?
Well, President Trump, as you recall, wanted to end the lockdowns. I think the thing that did the most damage to our country was the lockdowns that shut down 3.5 million businesses in our country with no due process, no just compensation. All of our churches closed our schools, and our children are still paying the price for that. And yet we had the worst outcome of any country in the world.
How so?
We have the highest death rate from COVID of any nation on earth.
Well, let me just say, because I've heard you say that before on the death rate from COVID, it's not accurate because public health experts say that there is a combination of factors that went into that: higher rates of chronic illnesses, which I know you would agree with, gaps to our healthcare system, and misinformation about vaccines.
But you just said what I said was inaccurate. What I said was accurate. We had the highest death rate from COVID of any place.
There are other countries that had higher, but
you can argue
go ahead
about why we had that, but nobody can tell you. I mean, we have, as you say, we have the highest chronic disease burden in the world.
Look at this dickhead flounder when his lies are challenged. He was spewing the GBD narrative about lockdowns while pushing his chronic disease bullshit. He got fact-checked to his face. We absolutely did not have the highest death rate, and the spiraling begins.
But Anthony Fauci was mismanaging the COVID pandemic, and he was doing it under the Biden administration. President Trump wanted to end the lockdowns. And in fact, in Anthony Fauci's diaries, he talks about how President Trump is calling him every day, trying to get him to reopen the country.
Yeah, well, the lockdowns were done by governors. I mean, certainly Anthony Fauci and the president had opinions, but the lockdowns were done by governors, and largely because they were hearing from hospitals saying that their ICUs were overrun and they needed some help while that was happening.
Well, that's not true. That's just not true.
It is
what
true.
You're saying it's not true. No, they were doing it because Anthony Fauci was telling them from the top, you need to lock down. There were ICUs that were empty all over the country, including in New York at the height.
Fauci had a gun to the head of every single governor and was telling them what to do. That's the kind of sick power that Fauci had. Give me a fucking break, Bobby. You're not talking to Joe Rogan here. And the notion that New York had empty ICUs at the height of the pandemic is fucking laughable. Every ICU was completely overrun and short-staffed while corpses were being loaded into freezer trucks because they had nowhere to stack them all. hospital. April 2020 alone saw nearly 25,000 deaths in the city, 60% of which were in hospitals. It was fucking pandemonium. What an asshole.
I'm asking you, I'm going to go back to what I asked you at the beginning, which is President Trump. And he was the guy in charge. And you tweeted back in 2024 that he let bureaucrats like Anthony Fauci shut down the entire country. Again, the president was in charge.
The president was trying to reopen the country when he left. The country was kept closed for another year, almost a year and a half after that.
Watching this creature try to vomit up his desperate pivot is just breathtaking. When he was running against Trump, he was all about how Trump let everything shut down. Now that he's in Trump's camp, it was stupid Biden who let it happen, even though he wasn't the fucking president at the time. He got caught flip-flopping, and he's running from it at breakneck speed so that Daddy Donald doesn't kick him in the ass.
There are 15 million frontline physicians around the world. They're mainly now connected through the internet. We can tell on the front lines what's working and what's not. If we had listened to those doctors during the COVID pandemic, we would have saved potentially millions of lives. There were therapeutics out there that were working. There were doctors that were having no deaths from COVID and treating, in some cases, thousands of patients. And we weren't listening to them. Instead, we were doing the opposite.
Which therapeutics were those, Bobby? Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine? You know damn well they didn't do shit, so I don't know what you're trying to pull off here.
The doctors who were saying you're doing it wrong were being marginalized and vilified.
Yeah,
and
because again, I really want to move on. But
yeah,
you were saying you were
yes, you were part of the problem.
No, I wasn't part of the problem.
There was absolute press malpractice. You weren't allowing your
Mr.
job,
Secretary,
your job is a fierce skepticism toward authority. And
yes,
you weren't doing that. You
I
were
am.
beating
My
up
job
on people
is also
who were dissenting.
No. Okay, you want to sit here and attack me, or do you want to have conversations
you're sitting
about
here and
public health?
attacking me.
I'm not attacking you. I'm asking questions about how to prevent the next pandemic.
Question, and I'll tell you.
That's what I'm trying to do. But I also don't want to use this interview to allow you to say things that aren't entirely true. You're talking about therapeutics, fine. It is also factually true that the COVID vaccine worked. The COVID vaccine prevented deaths. There is data upon data upon data.
I love watching Dana just neuter this prick. The scientists were lying. The reporters like you were lying. Only I was telling the truth with my obvious lies. Why are you attacking me with your simple questions that expose my lies? Fucking ridiculous.
Let's talk about the measles, please, because this is something that is happening as we speak. The cases in the U.S.
vaccine protected children?
No, don't ask me about measles. I am single-handedly responsible for dozens of child measles deaths globally, so let me pivot back to COVID like a fucking weasel.
I think that what I have talked to scientists and doctors
You've talked
about.
to scientists. Can you show me one study?
Yes, I can.
That shows that
I can.
Children were protected by the COVID vaccine.
I can tell you that
That vaccine did more good than harm to children. Can you show me one study that shows that?
I can tell you that when it comes to the vaccine, there have been studies that show that because of vaccine disinformation, there could have been 100 to 200,000 lives in the U.S. saved. But because people didn't get the vaccine, that's why. I'm not saying that it entirely.
You are saying nonsense. You are saying something that you cannot show me a single study.
I am not saying nonsense.
You are talking what somebody told you.
Excuse me.
And you
let me
cite me the study.
What
study?
No, what
Cite
studies
me
are
the
you
study.
talking about? You're talking about studies that actually don't exist.
This has such principle talking down to the insubordinate teenager vibes, and I'm here for it. We all know Bobby hallucinates studies out of thin air for his bogus Maha reports. He's being called out for it, and he's floundering.
The measles cases in the U.S. just reached a 35-year high. The second record-breaking year in a row, 93% of these cases are among the unvaccinated. The outbreak is happening on your watch. And even before becoming HHS secretary, for years, you have been one of the leading voices questioning the efficacy of vaccines. Do you accept some responsibility for this measles outbreak?
Absolutely not. First of all, this is an international outbreak. So And we're doing better at handling it than any country in the world.
Yeah, the guy who spews lies about the MMR vaccine, directly causing waves of vaccine hesitancy for that vaccine, is somehow not responsible for kids dying from a disease that would have been prevented by the MMR vaccine they didn't get because their brainwashed parents didn't give it to them. Airtight. No, Bobby, the rise in measles cases is absolutely unprecedented. It does not represent any kind of global trend, and it's happening specifically because of you more than any other individual person. You murder children, and you should be in jail.
Why not, because you are HHS secretary now, why not study what could cause autism, which scientists do believe starts with fetal brain development? Why not do some studies on that, whether you're an environmental lawyer, whether there are environmental factors that go into contributing to a predisposed genetic situation?
Well, let me say this first. We're doing all those things, and that's one of the ways that we found Tylenol. There's 73 studies out there and linked Tylenol exposure during later pregnancy and during the perinatal period to autism onset.
Yes, he actually just drew attention to the Tylenol crap, one of the most embarrassing moments in the history of public health, which I covered in this video. Give that a watch if you want some laughs.
But you are wrong when you say that this issue has been studied. It has been studied, and you're rolling your eyes, Dana. But
I am, because I don't want to have you use our air to say this. There have been more than 40 studies involving 5.6 million people to conclude there is no link between vaccines and autism. This is the head of the Committee of Infectious Diseases for the American Academy of Pediatrics.
And now let me tell you what the Institute of Medicine says, which is the National Academy of Sciences, which is the ultimate arbiter on vaccine safety, and which it does not have an interest in this debate. It says that none of the 8 vaccines that are administered during the first 6 months of life have ever been studied for a relationship to autism. It found 2 studies, one on the DTP vaccine, that showed that it does cause autism, and one on the hepatitis B vaccine. And again, suggests that it does cause autism.
Total utter horseshit I debunked in my RFK video. He has the balls to first claim that this shit has never been studied, which of course is an insane lie. It's one of the most studied things in the history of vaccinology just because of how pernicious the lie has been ever since its genesis with Andrew Wakefield, the piece of shit fraud. If vaccines caused autism, you'd think that in studies of millions of children that they would cause some fucking autism. But no dice, so we has to just lie some more about what so-called studies did or did not do.
So you are actually looking at, you're starting new studies to try to link autism, but you're also telling me—
I'm not trying to link autism to anything. I'm trying to find out, why is autism gone
Are you
from
also
less
trying
than
to,
why
are you
is
also trying to
autism
find
gone?
out how it interacts with people's DNA, what's predisposed to have an autistic child? Are you doing both?
Yeah, but Dana, you probably don't understand this because you're not a scientist, but genes
you're not
don't
either.
cause.
You dumb broad, you're not even a scientist, said the brain-dead, raw sewage bathing, raw meat eating, raw milk drinking, roided out non-scientist. Dana was asking about genetics because autism is fucking genetic. So whatever bullshit Bobby wants to claim regarding environmental exposure, is he testing that in conjunction with what we know about genetics? Bobby has to pivot to insulting her because he can't answer the question since he can't admit that autism is fucking genetic.
Genes don't cause epidemics.
I understand. Genes,
They can provide a
epidemics.
vulnerability.
A
but you
gene
need
provides
an
environmental.
exposure.
That's what I'm asking. Are you studying the environmental
We're looking
exposure?
at all the different environmental exposures, but your statement, you have been fooled. Your statement that this has been studied is not true. It's categorically
It is
not true.
considered.
Not for any of the studies.
It is considered.
Considered
decided
by who?
By every scientist who has studied this.
That is not true. I can give you
true.
hundreds of scientists who have looked at this.
So
and
on the
say,
one
why
hand,
is
you
it?
are. Do you understand
It's
why
the
people aren't
National
getting?
Academy of Sciences. What greater authority
Do you
have
understand
than
why
that?
people are not getting measles vaccines? Because they're hearing you say that it could cause
You're trying
autism.
to change the subject.
I'm not. It's very much
Yeah, you are.
related.
Show me one of the studies that's been done on the first 8 the vaccines during the first 6 months of life, you will not find them.
He's just lying, as always. Hep B, DTaP, polio, all of the vaccines given at every age, including those in the first 6 months, have been studied exhaustively with regard to autism onset, and no link has ever been found. Ever. And there never will be, because vaccines do not fucking cause autism. When will this shit finally die?
Let me ask you something. Do you see your job as ending vaccine hesitancy, or do you see your job as telling the truth to the American people?
I see my job as telling the truth, and the truth is that there is study after study after study. It's one of the most studied things out there in science.
You're repeating
and it
it like a parrot. You're repeating it like a parrot. I've actually read the science. Let's you and I come back here and debate the science.
I'm not debating this with you.
Of course you won't.
No, because I'm not
all
debating.
All you know how to do is repeat things that people told you and say, trust the experts. That's what you did during COVID.
No, asshole. You're the one spewing lie after lie after lie, expecting your Maha base to parrot the crap you say. This is pure projection. You've never read a study in your life. I've seen no evidence that you're even literate.
Now we know that Anthony Fauci, who was the expert, was lying about everything, about masks, about social distancing, about natural immunity, about the transmission from the vaccine, about the source of COVID. He was lying, and you were punishing people for not trusting the experts. And now you're rolling out the experts again. Yes. To talk about something that you have no personal knowledge of.
And again, the desperate pivot back to Fauci, which is why he's here in the first place, not to be forced to defend his blatant lies about vaccines. Fuck me, this guy should never speak publicly ever.
Okay, well, guess what? That is my job, to talk to people.
Your job is to tell the truth to the American public.
Yes, and my job is to get as much information as I can.
And to maintain
what we were doing,
skepticism.
What we were doing in COVID and still, with regard to these vaccines, is getting the best information, the best science that we can, and putting it out there. And sir, what you are doing is causing information to be out there that is not accurate.
Who was lying to
you?
The
National Academy of Sciences, which you just cited in November, said we support the statement that vaccines do not cause autism. This is the National Academy of Sciences that you just talked about.
Look at the National Academy of Sciences' most recent report.
Okay.
And of course, that most recent report doesn't exist. What a complete train wreck for Bobby. Under any other administration, he'd be fired on the spot. But for the Donald, he's doing just fine. Anyway, that'll wrap it up here. In summary, Fauci is a hero who has been maligned for utterly transparent political reasons. To maintain the credibility of lab leak propaganda, pro-oligarchy protocol like Great Barrington Declaration, and everything else that serves the interest of the state to the detriment of the general public, whose lives this administration could not give two shits about. Anyone who's been running their mouths this week about Fauci's diary or him pleading the fifth and gloating about how vindicated they are in having fallen for the never-ending character assassination of this man is just proudly admitting what gullible morons they are. Fuck Trump, fuck Jay Bhattacharya, fuck Marty McCary, fuck Bobby Kennedy, fuck Tulsi Gabbard, fuck Rand Paul, fuck Matt Ridley, fuck Elon Musk, fuck Peter Thiel, and every other asshole who thinks it's appropriate to ruin the lives of honest public servants in pursuit of the almighty dollar. Hopefully a few people that had fallen for this propaganda were able to make it through this video and now see the deception for what it is. So that's it for Fauci, the not-so-evil scientist. This one really brought together a lot of the figures I'd been debunking over the past few years, and for good reason, because they're all aligned with the same goal: serving the oligarchy. Whether it's lab leak, climate change, or genocide, the desires of the very few will always outweigh the rights of the many. And it's only going to get worse from here. I'll see you next time.